Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the past sometimes hides not in dusty archives or crumbling walls, but in the quiet dark below the waterline. Patient, still, waiting for someone to ask the right question. There is something about the sea and its relationship with memory. Water does not forget the way land does. Land gets built over, ploughed under, renamed, repurposed. Cities rise on top of cities. But the sea simply holds what it takes. It does not transform the things it swallows so much as it keeps them, slowly in its own way, under pressure and silt and darkness, at the bottom of a world we can barely reach. And so when a city disappears into the ocean, it does not truly vanish. It just becomes unreachable, which is a different thing entirely. Tonight we're going to spend some time with one of those unreachable places. A city that was once described in ancient poetry as so magnificent, so full of life and trade and colour and sound, that even the gods themselves were said to have taken notice. A city that sat on the southeastern coast of India, on the edge of the Bay of Bengal, at the mouth of the Great Kaveri River. A city that Tamil poets wrote about with such specific, careful detail, its harbour and its warehouses and the sound of the sea against its walls, that it is very difficult to read those descriptions and believe the place was only imagined. And a city that, according to both ancient texts and modern sonar surveys, now sits somewhere beneath the water, submerged, lost, or perhaps more accurately, waiting. The city is called Poompuhar. It is also known by its older name Kavaripattinam. And the Bay of Bengal, which is one of the largest bays on Earth, stretches above what some researchers believe are its ruins, somewhere between 5 and 23 metres below the surface, depending on which part of the site you're asking about. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you tonight? Are you at home? Somewhere familiar, with the lights low and a window cracked just slightly? Or are you somewhere else entirely? Maybe travelling? Maybe in a city that is still wide awake even though you are trying not to be? What time is it where you are? And is there any water nearby? A river? A rain-wet street? The sound of something running in the pipes? There is something fitting about listening to this particular story near water, or at least near the memory of it. Because Poompuhar is, in many ways, a story about what water keeps and what it takes, and about how long a civilization can hold on to the name of something it has lost. If you find this kind of story worthwhile, the slow, careful kind that takes its time and does not rush you toward a conclusion, I would be genuinely grateful if you gave this video a like and subscribe to Life Beyond Seen. It helps this quiet channel find its way to other people who enjoy sitting with a mystery for a while, without needing it resolved by the end of the night. There is no obligation, of course, but it does make a real difference. And now, let us settle in. The city of Poompuhar did not simply disappear. That is the first thing worth understanding. It did not vanish overnight. It did not get swallowed in a single dramatic moment the way a disaster film might suggest. Or at least, that is not the whole story. What happened to Poompuhar is something more layered than that, and more interesting. It left traces behind. Traces in stone, yes, and in sand, but also in something perhaps more durable than either of those things. It left traces in verse. In poetry written and recited and copied and preserved across nearly 2,000 years of Tamil literary tradition. In epics that describe the city's streets and festivals and the smell of the sea wind coming off the harbour. In a cultural memory so persistent and so specific that modern researchers have taken it seriously as a potential guide to where the physical ruins might actually be. That combination, the literary record and the physical evidence, is what makes Poompuhar unusual among submerged sites. Most underwater ruins are discovered by accident, or by geological survey, or by fishermen snagging their nets on something that should not be there. Poompuhar is a place where people already knew, or at least believed, that something was down there. The question was never really whether the city existed. The Tamil literary tradition never doubted that. The question was whether the physical world could confirm what the poetry had been saying for centuries. And that question, it turns out, is genuinely complicated. Not in a frustrating way, but in the way that real historical puzzles tend to be complicated, where the evidence is real and the gaps are real, and the honest answer involves holding several possibilities at once without forcing any of them into certainty. Some of what has been found beneath the Bay of Bengal near Poompuhar is well documented and credible. Some of it is disputed. Some of it is genuinely unknown. And at least one part of it, a structure found at a depth that implies a very specific and startling age, remains one of the more quietly remarkable unresolved questions in the archaeology of South Asia. We're going to take our time with all of it. The city as it was described in life, the texts that recorded its end, the underwater surveys that began in the 1980s, and what they actually found as opposed to what has sometimes been claimed. The geological science that tells us what certain depths mean in terms of when land was last above water, the broader context of submerged sites around the world, the cultural memory that kept this city alive in Tamil identity for 2 millennia, and the practical, logistical and political reasons why the site has never been fully excavated, despite the fact that what is down there might be genuinely extraordinary. There is no single clean answer at the end of this story. I want to be honest about that from the beginning. This is not a story where we arrive at a final revelation and everything clicks into place. It is a story about what we know, what we do not know, and what it would mean if one particular piece of the puzzle turned out to be exactly what some researchers believe it might be. That kind of uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is actually the most interesting part of it. Because here is the thing about Poompuhar. The historically documented city, the one that appears in the Tamil epics, the one that was a major Chola dynasty port trading with Rome and Southeast Asia, that city almost certainly existed. The evidence for it is strong. The shallow underwater finds near the coast are consistent with it. There is no serious dispute about whether a significant ancient city once stood at the mouth of the Kaveri River. That part is not the mystery. The mystery is the deeper structure. The one found approximately 5 kilometers offshore, in roughly 23 meters of water. The one whose depth implies, based on what we know about sea level change after the last ice age, that the land it sits on was last above water somewhere between 7,000 and 11,000 years ago. If that structure is man-made, and that question has not been definitively answered, then it belongs to a period of human history that we currently know almost nothing about in this part of the world. It would push the story of organised settlement in South Asia back by thousands of years, past the Indus Valley civilization, past anything currently on the accepted timeline. That is a significant claim. And significant claims require significant evidence, which is precisely what this site does not yet have in sufficient quantity. Not because people have not looked, but because looking at the bottom of the Bay of Bengal is genuinely, technically difficult in ways that are easy to underestimate. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The story begins not with sonar readings and diving reports. It begins with a city that was alive and loud and prosperous, and full of people who did not know they were living in a place that would one day become a mystery. It begins with the Kaveri River reaching the sea, with ships in a harbour, with the smell of spices in a warehouse, with poetry being composed about streets that the poets could actually walk down. The city did not simply disappear, it left traces. And those traces, in stone, in sand, in verse, and in the memory of a civilization that never forgot it, are what we're going to follow tonight, carefully, slowly, one layer at a time. The sea above Poompuhar is not dramatic at the surface. The Bay of Bengal at the Tamil Nadu coast can be rough during monsoon season, but for much of the year it is simply the sea, wide and blue-grey and ordinary looking, the way most places that hold extraordinary things tend to look from the outside. There is a small modern town there now, also called Poompuhar, quiet and coastal, with a shore temple and a museum, and the Kaveri River still reaching the water at the same delta it has always used. The river does not know what it is flowing past, or if it does, it gives nothing away. But somewhere out there, beneath that ordinary-looking water, something is sitting on the seafloor, something that was, at some point above the surface. Something that may or may not have been built by human hands, something that the poetry of a 2,000-year-old civilization may have been trying to tell us about all along, in the only language it had available, which was myth and metaphor and the careful memory of loss. That is where we begin. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was there. And what was there, according to both the historical record and the literary tradition, was not a small fishing village or a modest seasonal port. Poompuhar, also known in older sources as Kavarapatinam, was the capital port of the early Chola dynasty, one of the longest-lasting ruling dynasties in recorded human history. The Cholas would go on to build some of the most elaborate temple complexes in the world, to project naval power across the Indian Ocean, to establish trade routes that reached as far as China and East Africa. But in their early centuries, before the Great Temple building period, before the naval campaigns, their seat of power was here, at the mouth of the Kaveri River, where the river meets the Bay of Bengal in what is now the southeastern coast of Tamil Nadu. The Kaveri is not a small river. It rises in the Western Ghats, runs roughly 800 kilometers eastward across the Deccan Plateau, and spreads into a broad delta before reaching the sea. In antiquity, that delta would have been even more productive than it is today, supporting agriculture, freshwater supply, and the kind of dense, sustained settlement that only becomes possible when the land around a city can reliably feed it. A city at the mouth of such a river, with access to the sea on one side and a fertile delta on the other, was not there by accident. It was there because the geography made it almost inevitable. What we know about the city itself comes primarily from two Tamil literary works, the Silapatikaram and the Manimekalai. These are among the most celebrated texts in the Sangam literary tradition, a body of classical Tamil poetry and prose generally dated to somewhere between the 2nd and 5th centuries of the Common Era, though some scholars place portions of the tradition earlier. The Silapatikaram, whose title translates roughly as the tale of an anklet, is sometimes described as the first great Tamil epic. It tells the story of a merchant named Kovalan and his wife Kanagi, and much of the early part of the narrative is set in Kavarapatinam. The Manimekalai is in some ways a sequel, following a character from the same story into a Buddhist philosophical journey. Together, these texts give us something rare for a city of this age, a detailed literary portrait of what it looked and felt like to be there. And the portrait is vivid. The Kalapatikaram describes a harbour busy with ships from distant lands, their masts visible above the waterline like a forest planted in the sea. It describes warehouses stacked with goods, streets organised by trade, neighbourhoods where different communities lived alongside each other, each with their own customs and languages. Merchants from the Mediterranean world are mentioned, so are traders from Southeast Asia. The city had a lighthouse, which is specifically referenced in the text as a structure that guided ships in at night. A functional piece of infrastructure described with the same matter-of-fact tone one might use for a market or a gate. There were temples, gardens, wide streets, and a festival culture that the poets clearly found worth describing in some detail. The sound of music is mentioned, the smell of flowers, the movement of people in the evening. These are not the descriptions of a frontier settlement. They are the descriptions of a place that had been settled and organised and comfortable long enough to develop a rich civic life. What the texts describe in terms of trade is consistent with what we know from other sources about the Indian Ocean trade network in this period. Rome was, by the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, an enormous consumer of goods from South Asia. Roman coins have been found at multiple archaeological sites in Tamil Nadu, including some not far from the Poompuhar area. The goods flowing westward included black pepper, which the Romans consumed in quantities that seem almost impossible today, as well as cinnamon, cardamom, fine cotton textiles and pearls. The pearls from the Gulf of Mannar, the body of water just south of the Kaveri Delta, were considered among the finest in the ancient world. They appear in Roman texts. They appear in Greek accounts. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing around the turn of the 1st century of the Common Era, described the wealth of Indian ports in terms that make it clear this was not marginal or occasional commerce. It was a regular, organised, high-volume trade. Going the other direction, ships from Poompuhar would have reached what are now Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and further into the archipelagos of Southeast Asia. The Mani Mekhalai's protagonist travels to several of these places, which is one reason scholars treat the text as containing at least some geographical and cultural information about actual trade routes and destinations. The Buddha's philosophical content is the primary focus, but the setting is grounded in a real maritime world that the author clearly knew something about. Population estimates for Kavrapattinam are difficult to make with any precision, as they tend to be for ancient cities where we are relying on literary description rather than archaeological census. But the scale of what is described, the diversity of the population, the complexity of the trade, the presence of multiple temples and neighbourhoods, and a functioning harbour with a lighthouse, suggests a city of considerable size. Some researchers have proposed figures in the tens of thousands. Others are more cautious. What seems clear is that this was not a small place. It was a regional capital with international connections, and its position at the Kaveri Delta made it one of the more strategically and economically significant locations on the eastern coast of the Indian subcontinent. The Silapatikram also gives us something else that turns out to be important later in the story. It gives us a sense of the city's relationship with the sea. That relationship, as described in the text, was not simply practical. It was also anxious. The sea appears in the epic not just as a trade route, but as a force with its own intentions. Ships are launched with prayers. Storms are described with a kind of respect that suggests the poets understood perfectly well that the sea could give and take in equal measure. The harbour is celebrated, but the water beyond it is treated with care. This might simply be the natural attitude of any coastal civilization that depends on the sea for its livelihood. But it might also be something else. It might be a cultural memory of what the sea had already done, or what people feared it might do again. Because there is another layer to the Silapatikram's portrait of Kavrapattinam, one that tends to get less attention than the descriptions of the harbour and the markets. The text also contains references to land that had already been lost to the sea before the time of the story. There are passages that acknowledge, almost in passing, that the coastline was not fixed, that the sea had taken things before, that certain places which people remembered or referenced no longer existed above the waterline. These references are not dwelt upon. They are not presented as the central drama. They appear almost as background fact, the way a modern person might mention that a neighbourhood used to extend further before a highway was built through it. The sea had taken land. This was known. This was part of the world the epic was set in. That detail matters because it suggests that the people who composed and transmitted these texts were not simply recording an imagined catastrophe as metaphor. They were describing a coastline that had already changed within living memory, or within the memory of the generations just before them, and they were doing so in a way that treated this as a real, physical fact about their world. The sea moved. The land changed. Things that had been above water were now below it. This was not mythology. This was geography. The city described in these texts was, by any reasonable measure, a major civilization hub. It was connected to the wider world through trade. It had infrastructure, culture, religious life, and a population diverse enough that its streets were home to people from multiple languages and traditions. It was, in the language of the modern historian, a cosmopolitan port, and it sat at the edge of a body of water that, as the poets themselves acknowledged, had a long history of taking things back. Which brings us naturally to the question that the texts themselves raise but do not fully answer. If this city was so significant, so well connected, so deeply embedded in the cultural memory of the Tamil tradition, what happened to it? The poets who described it were not writing from a ruined city. They were writing from memory, or from an earlier tradition, about a place that was already gone, or going. The Mani Mekhalai contains passages that describe the sea encroaching on the city, that describe structures being swallowed, that describe a divine or natural catastrophe arriving from the water, these are not background details. They are part of the story. The city's relationship with the sea, in the literary tradition, does not end with the harbour and the lighthouse and the merchant ships. It ends with something else entirely. And that ending, described in poetry composed somewhere between 1500 and 2000 years ago, is where the story begins to get genuinely complicated. Because the texts describe a loss. They describe a city taken by the sea. They describe this with enough specificity that it does not read like pure invention. But they also describe it in the language of myth, of divine punishment, of gods and festivals and cosmic consequence. And that combination, historical detail wrapped in mythological framework, is exactly the kind of evidence that is hardest to interpret. It is too specific to dismiss entirely. It is too mythologized to accept literally. It sits in that uncomfortable middle space where careful historians have to work slowly and honestly, separating what the text might be recording from what the text might be imagining. The Tamil literary tradition had a specific concept for the kind of loss described in these passages. It is called Kadal Kol, which translates roughly as the sea-taking. It appears not just in the Silapatikaram and the Manimekalai, but across a broader body of Tamil literature as a recognised named phenomenon. The sea-taking land, the sea reclaiming what had once been above water. This was not an isolated metaphor. It was a recurring motif in a literary tradition that was produced by a civilization living on a dynamic coastline, and it appears consistently enough that scholars have taken it seriously as a possible record of real geological events preserved in cultural memory. The question of when those events happened, and whether the texts are describing one catastrophe or an accumulation of smaller ones over centuries, is something we will come to in more detail shortly. But for now, the point is this. The literary evidence for Poompuhar is not vague. It is not the kind of thin, ambiguous reference that requires a great deal of interpretive generosity to read as historical. It is detailed, specific, and produced by a tradition that clearly regarded the loss of this city as a real event worth recording and mourning. The city was there. The city was significant. And then, by the account of the people who remembered it, the sea came for it. That is the literary record. It is the oldest layer of evidence we have, and in some ways it is the most evocative, because it was written by people who still felt the loss as a loss, not as an archaeological puzzle or a scientific question, but as a wound in the cultural memory of a civilization that had watched something extraordinary slip beneath the water. What the archaeology has found since then, beginning with surveys in the 1980s and continuing into the early years of this century, is a different kind of evidence. Harder in some ways, more ambiguous in others, and in at least one particular detail, genuinely startling in what it implies about how old the story of this city might actually be. So let us stay with the texts for a little longer, because they deserve that attention. The literary record of Poompuhar's destruction is not a single line tucked into the margins of an ancient manuscript. It is woven into the narrative structure of works that were themselves considered among the highest achievements of early Tamil literature. And within those works, the passages describing the sea's arrival at the city are written with a kind of grief that is hard to mistake for simple allegory. The Manimekalai, composed somewhere in the range of the 2nd to 5th century of the Common Era, is a Buddhist epic poem in Tamil. Its central narrative follows a young woman named Manimekalai, the daughter of a celebrated dancer, through a series of spiritual and philosophical encounters. The poem is rich, layered, and deeply concerned with questions of suffering, compassion, and the nature of existence. But embedded within it, almost as a setting rather than a plot point, is the city of Kavaripatinam, which is another name for Poompuhar, and the poem describes this city in the present tense of its own narrative as a living, breathing place, and then it describes what the sea did to it. There is a passage in the Manimekalai that describes a festival called Indra Vija, a celebration held in honour of the god Indra, the deity associated with rain, storms, and the sky. The festival was held near the shore, and the poem describes it as a great public occasion, the kind of event that would have drawn the whole city to the waterfront. Music, processions, offerings, the sea visible and present as a backdrop to the ceremony. And then the poem describes the sea rising, not metaphorically, not as a distant warning, but as an event that interrupted the festival, that arrived at the shore while people were gathered there, that took the city in a way that the text frames as both catastrophic and, in some interpretations, as connected to a failure of proper ritual observance. Some scholars have read the Indravija passage as a mythological explanation for a real geological event. The idea being that a sudden inundation, perhaps a storm surge, perhaps a tsunami, perhaps a more gradual but still dramatic episode of coastal flooding, was encoded in the cultural memory of the community as a divine event, as something that happened because of a breakdown in the relationship between the human world and the sacred world. This is not an unusual pattern in ancient literature. Many cultures around the world have encoded real geological catastrophes into religious or mythological narratives. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755, which is modern by comparison, was interpreted almost immediately in theological terms by many of the people who survived it. The human impulse to find meaning in catastrophe is not a sign that the catastrophe did not happen. It is a sign that it did. The Tamil concept of Kadal Kol, which we touched on briefly before, is worth dwelling on for a moment. The phrase itself is plain and direct. Kadal means sea. Kol means taking, or sometimes rendered as seizure, the sea-taking. It appears in the Silapatikaram as well, which is the other great Tamil epic of this period, and it appears in a context that is similarly specific. The Silapatikaram, which tells the story of a woman named Kanagi and the injustice done to her husband in the city of Madurai, also references Poompuhar as a real place, a place with a specific geography, specific streets, specific landmarks. And within its references to the coastal world, the concept of the sea-taking land is treated as something that happens, something that has happened, something that is part of the understood landscape of the Tamil coastal world. What is notable about Kadal Kol as a concept is that it is not singular. It does not refer to one specific event. It is a recurring phenomenon in the Tamil literary imagination, and that recurrence suggests something important. The people who produced this literature were living on a coastline that they understood to be dynamic, unstable, and capable of dramatic change. They were not describing a coastline that had always been as it was and always would be. They were describing a coastline that moved, that took things, that had a history of taking things. There is a broader tradition in Tamil culture that extends this idea considerably further. It is called Kumari Kandam, and it refers to a legendary landmass said to have existed to the south of the Indian subcontinent, a vast territory that Tamil tradition describes as the original homeland of Tamil civilization, a place where the earliest Tamil academies, called Sangams, were held, a place of extraordinary antiquity and cultural richness that was eventually swallowed by the sea. Kumari Kandam is a complex subject, and it is important to be careful about how it is handled. In its more elaborate modern forms, it has become entangled with nationalist narratives about Tamil civilization being the oldest in the world, claims that go well beyond what any archaeological or geological evidence currently supports. But the kernel of the tradition, the idea of a lost southern landmass, the idea that the sea had once stood much further south and west than it does today, is not entirely without geological grounding. The sea levels of the Indian Ocean have changed dramatically over geological time. The coastline of southern India did extend further into what is now open water during periods of lower sea level. Whether that geological reality maps onto the specific claims of the Kumari Kandam tradition is a separate question, and an honest answer is that the tradition as it exists in its fullest form goes considerably beyond what the science can confirm. But the underlying intuition that the sea had taken significant amounts of land from the southern Indian coast is not wrong. It is, in fact, geologically accurate, The question is one of scale, timing, and the degree to which cultural memory can reliably preserve information about events that happened thousands of years ago. This is a question that scholars across multiple disciplines have spent considerable effort thinking about. The field, sometimes called geomythology, examines the ways in which geological events, floods, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, coastal inundations, may be preserved in oral and literary traditions over very long periods. The evidence for this kind of preservation is real and documented. There are Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that appear to describe specific coastline changes that occurred as sea levels rose after the last ice age, changes that can be dated by geological evidence to thousands of years ago. There are Pacific Island traditions that appear to preserve memories of volcanic events that modern geology can date. The human capacity to transmit geographically specific information across many generations through oral tradition is better than many people assume, particularly when that information is embedded in stories, rituals, and cultural practices that give it a reason to be remembered. This does not mean that every ancient flood story is a literal record of a real geological event. It does not mean that the Kumari Kandam tradition is a reliable map of a lost continent. But it does mean that when a literary tradition produced by a civilization living on a specific coastline repeatedly describes the sea-taking land, describes specific cities being swallowed, describes a named festival being interrupted by a rising sea, and does so with enough geographic specificity that the locations can be identified on a modern map, it is worth taking seriously as possible historical memory rather than dismissing it as pure invention. The Manamekalai's description of the Indravija and the sea's arrival is particularly interesting in this regard because of the level of detail it contains. It does not simply say the sea rose, it describes the festival context, the location near the shore, the suddenness of the event, and the nature of what was lost. This is the kind of specificity that tends to survive in oral and literary tradition when the event being described was real enough and significant enough to be worth preserving accurately. A purely invented catastrophe does not require geographic precision. A remembered one does. There is also the question of what kind of event the texts might be describing. The framing of divine punishment, the connection to the Indravija festival, and a possible failure of ritual observance is the mythological layer. Beneath that layer, scholars have proposed several possible physical mechanisms. A major storm surge or cyclone striking the low-lying coastal city during a festival season. A tsunami generated by a seismic event in the Bay of Bengal or the Indian Ocean, which is a seismically active region with a documented history of generating large waves. A more gradual but still dramatic episode of coastal flooding associated with a period of higher sea levels or increased storm activity, or some combination of these factors occurring over a relatively short period, perhaps a series of damaging events that collectively destroyed the city's infrastructure and drove its population inland, encoded in cultural memory as a single catastrophic moment. None of these explanations can be confirmed from the literary evidence alone. The texts tell us that something happened, that it came from the sea, that it was devastating, and that it was remembered as a defining loss. They do not give us a date. They do not give us a mechanism that can be verified independently. They give us the cultural memory of a catastrophe, which is a real and meaningful kind of evidence, but it is evidence that requires corroboration from other sources before it can be treated as historical fact rather than historical possibility. What the texts do establish, with reasonable confidence, is that Poompuhar was a real city, that it was located on the southeastern coast of India, at the mouth of the Kaveri River, that it was a major and cosmopolitan place, and that it was understood by the people who wrote about it to have been lost to the sea. That last point is not a minor one. The literary tradition is not ambiguous on this. The city did not decline gradually. It did not simply fade. The sea took it. That is the consistent account across multiple texts produced by a tradition that had no obvious reason to invent a catastrophe for a city that its own culture held in high regard. And so, when researchers began, in the latter decades of the 20th century, to look at the seafloor off the coast of Tamil Nadu near the modern town of Poompuhar, they were not working from nothing. They were working from a detailed literary tradition that said, with considerable specificity, there was a city here and the sea took it. The question was whether the physical evidence would support that claim, whether the floor of the Bay of Bengal beneath the murky sedimented water off the Tamil Nadu coast held anything that corresponded to what the poets had described. The answer, when the divers went down, turned out to be more complicated than either the believers or the skeptics had anticipated. Because what they found was not one thing. It was two things, separated by depth, and by the vast and unsettling distance of geological time. The surveys began in 1981. That is the year that marks the first serious organised attempt to look beneath the water off the coast of Tamil Nadu and see whether the literary tradition had left anything behind in the sediment. The Archaeological Survey of India, working in coordination with the National Institute of Oceanography, sent teams to the waters near the modern town of Poompuhar, which sits at the mouth of the Kaveri River Delta, roughly where the ancient city was described as standing. It was not a dramatic beginning. These were methodical government surveys, not treasure hunts. The researchers were not looking for gold or monuments. They were looking for structural evidence, anything that might indicate organised human habitation, worked stone, fired brick, pottery, the kind of durable material that survives submergence and sedimentation when organic material does not. What they found in those early dives, and in subsequent surveys through the 1980s and into the 1990s, was concentrated in relatively shallow water, between 1 and 6 metres depth, close to the present shoreline. At those depths, the divers encountered brick walls. Not natural rock formations, not ambiguous shapes in the sediment, but actual fired brick, the kind used in construction, arranged in patterns consistent with man-made structures. They found pottery sherds, fragments of terracotta vessels, the kind of everyday domestic and commercial pottery that accumulates wherever people live and work over extended periods. They found terracotta figurines. They found what appeared to be the foundations of buildings, walls that had been standing structures at some point before the water came over them. The visibility in the Bay of Bengal is not generous. The water carries sediment from the Kaveri and from the broader coastal runoff of the Tamil Nadu coast, and it is murky in a way that makes underwater work slow and difficult. Divers working in these conditions are often feeling as much as seeing, moving their hands along surfaces in low light, reconstructing shapes from partial contact rather than clear visual inspection. But what they were feeling and seeing was consistent enough across multiple dives and multiple surveys to be taken seriously. One structure in particular drew attention during the shallow water surveys. At roughly 5 to 6 metres depth, divers encountered what has been described as a horseshoe-shaped structure, a curved arrangement of stone and brick material roughly 20 metres across. Its function was not immediately obvious. Researchers proposed various interpretations. It could have been a granary, a ritual structure of some kind, a feature of the harbour infrastructure, perhaps a dock element, or a protective breakwater. The construction material and general form were consistent with what is known of early historic period building in the region, broadly comparable to Chola-era architectural practice documented in onshore sites. Without controlled excavation and reliable dating, it was not possible to assign it a precise age, but its presence at that depth, in that location, was consistent with the idea that this was part of the historically known Poompuhar, the city described in the Sangam literature, the Chola period port that the text said the sea had taken. At 5 or 6 metres depth close to shore, this was not an extraordinary finding in geological terms. Coastal erosion and gradual subsidence can account for the submergence of structures at that depth over the course of a few centuries to a couple of thousand years. The shallow finds were real, they were documented, and they were interesting. But they were, in a sense, the expected part of the story. The unexpected part was deeper. During the surveys, researchers also identified something further offshore, roughly 5 kilometres out from the present coastline, at a depth of approximately 23 metres. This is a different category of finding entirely, not because the object itself was necessarily more dramatic in appearance, but because of what 23 metres of water depth implies about when that surface was last exposed to air. At 5 or 6 metres depth, close to shore, you're dealing with relatively recent submergence in geological terms. At 23 metres, 5 kilometres offshore, you're dealing with something that has been underwater for a very long time. The structure at that depth, as reported by the divers and by sonar analysis, was described as large, roughly U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped, similar in general outline to the shallower horseshoe structure but significantly bigger. Estimates of its dimensions placed it at roughly 40 metres across. It was not a small object. It was not a fragment or a scatter of loose material. It was a coherent shape of considerable size sitting on the seafloor at a depth that immediately raised a question that was difficult to answer comfortably. The difficulty of working at 23 metres in the Bay of Bengal should not be underestimated. At that depth, in those waters, visibility can drop to almost nothing in certain seasons and conditions. The sediment load in the water column, the particulate matter stirred up by currents and wave action, reduces visibility sometimes to less than a metre, occasionally to the point where a diver is working in near total darkness, with only a torch providing any light at all. The sea floor at that depth off the Tamil Nadu coast is not clean rock or clear sand. It is layered with sedimentation, with the accumulated deposit of centuries of riverine input and marine processes, and structures beneath that sediment are partially or wholly buried, their surfaces obscured, their edges blurred. Getting a clear picture of what is down there, its precise dimensions, its construction material, its internal organisation, is genuinely hard. The divers who visited the deeper structure were working in conditions that made careful examination difficult. What they could report was the general shape, the approximate scale, the sense that it was a coherent object rather than a random scattering of material. Beyond that, the picture became less precise. The National Institute of Oceanography published findings from their surveys in the 1990s and early 2000s, and the deeper structure appeared in their reports as a significant anomaly, something that warranted further investigation. The ASI's position was careful, as institutional positions on unresolved archaeological questions tend to be. They acknowledged the findings. They noted the deeper structure's existence. They did not make strong claims about its age or origin. This caution was appropriate given what was actually known, which was the structure's location, its approximate shape, and the depth at which it was found. What was not known, and what the surveys had not been able to establish, was whether it was definitively man-made, what it was constructed from at a material level, and when it was last above water. Those are not minor gaps. They are the central questions, and they remained open. The reason the depth matters so much comes down to the history of sea levels, which is a subject that will need its own careful treatment a little later in this story. But the short version is this. At 23 metres depth, 5 kilometres offshore from the present Tamil Nadu coastline, the seafloor in that location was almost certainly above water during a period of significantly lower global sea levels. The sea has not always sat where it sits today. During the last ice age, when enormous volumes of water were locked up in ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere, sea levels globally were dramatically lower than they are now. The coastlines of the world were in different places. Land that's now underwater was then exposed, inhabited, walked on, built on by people who had no way of knowing that the sea would eventually come for it. The Tamil Nadu coast was further out into what is now the Bay of Bengal. The river deltas extended further. There was more land, and at some point as the ice melted and the seas rose, that land went under. The question posed by the deeper structure at Poompuhar is whether something was built on that land before it was submerged, and if so, when? That question was not answered by the surveys of the 1980s and 1990s. The surveys established that something was there. They established its rough dimensions and location. They did not recover datable material from the deeper site. They did not conduct the kind of controlled stratigraphic excavation that would be needed to establish whether the structure was constructed by human hands or formed by natural geological processes, and if constructed, from what period. The lack of datable artifacts from the deep site is not a trivial problem. In submerged marine environments, organic material that would normally be used for carbon dating, wood, charcoal, bone, plant matter, degrades or becomes contaminated over time in ways that make dating unreliable. Getting a reliable date from an underwater site requires careful excavation, controlled sampling, and ideally the recovery of material from a sealed context that has not been disturbed by water movement or biological activity. None of that had been done at the deeper Poompuhar site by the time the surveys of the early 2000s concluded. What the surveys left behind was a finding that was real, documented, and genuinely unresolved. Something is at 23 metres depth off the coast of Poompuhar. It is roughly 40 metres across. It has a coherent shape that some researchers have described as consistent with a man-made structure. It has not been excavated. It has not been dated. It has not been definitively identified as either a human construction or a natural formation, and it sits at a depth that, if it is man-made, raises the possibility that it was built at a time considerably earlier than the historically known Poompuhar, earlier than the Chola dynasty, earlier than the Sangam period, earlier, potentially, than most of what we think of as the beginning of organised civilization in South Asia. That possibility was not loudly announced in the NIO's official reports. It was noted carefully as a question requiring further investigation. But it did not stay quiet for long. Because the surveys had produced enough information to attract attention from outside the academic community, from a writer and researcher who had been travelling the world looking at submerged sites, and asking exactly this kind of question. And his involvement with Poompuhar would, in the years that followed, bring the site to a global audience in a way that the NIO's published papers had not, while also generating a level of controversy that the site's careful, scientific investigators had not anticipated and did not entirely welcome. Before that story begins, though, it is worth sitting for a moment with what the surveys had actually established, stripped of interpretation and claim. The shallow finds near Poompuhar are credible, documented and consistent with the historically known Chola-era port city described in the Tamil literary tradition. Brick walls, pottery, terracotta objects, a horseshoe-shaped structure at 5 to 6 metres depth. These are the physical remains of a real city that was really submerged, and they align with the literary account in a way that is satisfying as corroboration of the basic historical claim. The sea did take Poompuhar, or at least a significant portion of it. That much seems well supported. The deeper structure is something else. It is real in the sense that something is there, at 23 metres, 5 kilometres offshore, with a shape that has been observed and described by multiple divers and recorded in official survey reports. It is unresolved in the sense that its nature, its age and its origin remain genuinely unknown. It is not proven to be man-made. It is not proven to be ancient in the way the more dramatic claims about it suggest. But it is also not explained away. No one has looked at it carefully enough to say definitively what it is. And that gap between what has been found and what has been understood is where the story of Poompuhar becomes genuinely complicated. Because into that gap stepped a very particular kind of attention, the kind that asks the largest possible questions, that connects the deepest possible dots, and that is not always constrained by the careful caution of institutional archaeology. And that attention changed the way the world heard about Poompuhar for better and for worse, in ways that are still shaping how the site is discussed today. The writer in question was Graham Hancock. If you have spent any time around topics like lost civilizations, submerged prehistory, or the deeper edges of archaeological debate, you have almost certainly encountered his name. He is a former journalist, a prolific author, and a genuinely compelling communicator who has, over several decades, built a large global audience around a central argument that human civilization is considerably older than mainstream archaeology acknowledges, that a sophisticated culture existed before the last ice age and was largely destroyed by the catastrophic flooding that followed it, and that the evidence for this is scattered across the world in submerged sites, ancient myths, and anomalous structures that conventional scholars have been too cautious or too institutionally constrained to properly investigate. His 2002 book Underworld is, in many ways, a travel record. Hancock spent years visiting submerged sites around the world, diving at them when he could, interviewing researchers, examining survey data, and building a cumulative argument that the post-glacial sea level rise swallowed not just coastlines, but entire civilizations. He visited sites in Japan, the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, and off the coast of India. Poompuhar was one of the sites he returned to repeatedly, and it became one of the more prominent examples in his argument. Hancock visited Poompuhar in the late 1990s and again in the early 2000s. He dived at the site with a team that included professional divers, and he documented what they saw at the deeper structure, the one at approximately 23 metres depth, 5 kilometres offshore. His descriptions of the dive are vivid. The visibility in the Bay of Bengal is notoriously poor, often only a metre or two, sometimes less. Diving there is not like diving in the clear warm water of a tropical reef. It is murky, disorienting and physically demanding. Hancock describes moving through greenish-grey water, feeling rather than seeing the seafloor, and encountering the structure as a large curved form rising from the sediment. He describes its shape as consistent with a constructed feature, deliberate in form, too coherent to be easily dismissed as a natural rock formation. His interpretation of what the structure represents is where the controversy begins. Hancock's argument is straightforward in its logic, even if its implications are dramatic. A structure at 23 metres depth, on a coast where sea levels have risen significantly since the end of the last ice age, must have been built when that land was above water. The question is when that land was last above water. Based on the global sea level data available at the time, Hancock argued that a depth of 23 metres off the Tamil Nadu coast pointed to a period of roughly 11,000 to 13,000 years ago, placing the structure's construction somewhere in the range of 9,000 to 11,000 BCE. That would put it at the very end of the last ice age, or just after it, in a period that mainstream archaeology at the time considered far too early for structured construction of any kind in South Asia. It would predate the earliest known phases of the Indus Valley civilization by several thousand years. It would predate Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, which dates to around 7,500 BCE and is often cited as one of the earliest known urban settlements. It would place organised human construction in South Asia at a time when the conventional narrative said people in that region were still living as hunter-gatherers. This was not a modest claim. Hancock presented it as evidence, or at least as strong circumstantial support, for his broader argument about a lost prehistoric civilization. He connected Poompuhar to the Tamil literary tradition of Kumari Kandam, the mythological lost landmass said to have existed to the south and southeast of the Indian subcontinent before being swallowed by the sea, and he suggested that the literary memory of this loss might be a cultural echo of a real geological event. He connected the Tamil flood myths in the Manimekalai and other texts to the same post-glacial flooding that, in his view, had destroyed this earlier civilization. The depth of the structure, the literary record, the geological history of sea level rise, the Tamil concept of Kadal Kol, all of it was woven together into a narrative that was, whatever one thought of its conclusions, genuinely compelling to read. Underworld sold well. It was translated into multiple languages. It brought Poompuhar to the attention of readers in dozens of countries who had never heard of the Tamil Sangam tradition, the Archaeological Survey of India, or the National Institute of Oceanography. For many people around the world, Graham Hancock was their first and only source of information about the submerged structures off the Tamil Nadu coast, and that is where the complications begin. The academic response to Hancock's work on Poompuhar was, to put it plainly, sceptical. Not uniformly hostile, but sceptical, and in some cases sharply critical. The criticisms came from several directions. The first and most fundamental was methodological. Hancock is not an archaeologist. He has no formal training in the discipline. His interpretations of what he observed during his dives were not subject to peer review. His dating arguments, while based on real sea level data, were applied in a way that professional geologists and archaeologists found oversimplified. The relationship between global sea level curves and local coastal conditions is not straightforward. Local factors including tectonic subsidence, sedimentation rates, delta dynamics, and regional variation in post-glacial rebound all affect the actual depth at which a given piece of land went underwater, and they affect it in ways that can shift the estimated date of submergence by thousands of years in either direction. Using a global sea level curve to assign a precise age to a specific structure at a specific depth on a specific coast, without local geological data to calibrate it, is not a method that produces reliable dates. It produces a range of possibilities, some of them plausible, some of them not, and Hancock's presentation of the most dramatic end of that range as the most likely answer was something professional researchers found difficult to accept. The second criticism was about the structure itself. Hancock described it as clearly man-made, as something that could not reasonably be explained as a natural formation. But the researchers who had actually surveyed the site in the 1980s and 1990s had been more cautious. The NIO's published reports described the structure's shape and dimensions, but did not make a definitive claim about its origin. The distinction between a man-made structure and a natural geological feature, particularly at depth, in poor visibility without excavation, is genuinely difficult to establish. Rock formations can take on surprisingly regular shapes. Sediment can accumulate around natural features in ways that make them appear more structured than they are. Without excavation, without stratigraphic analysis, without the recovery of artifacts from within or beneath the structure, saying with confidence that it was built by human hands is not something the available evidence supports. Hancock said it anyway, and critics argued that this was where his enthusiasm outran his evidence. The third criticism was broader and had less to do with Poompuhar specifically, and more to do with Hancock's overall project. His argument across Underworld and his other books rests on the existence of a sophisticated prehistoric civilization that has been largely erased from the archaeological record. Critics pointed out that this framing requires a significant conspiracy of absence, a situation in which an advanced culture left almost no durable trace, and that the evidence he assembled, while individually interesting, did not collectively add up to what he claimed. The submerged structures he cited, including Poompuhar, were real. The sea level history was real. The literary traditions were real. But connecting them into proof of a lost civilization required a series of interpretive leaps that the evidence did not compel. It is worth being clear about something here, because the line between legitimate criticism and unfair dismissal matters. The researchers who criticised Hancock were not, for the most part, arguing that there was nothing interesting at Poompuhar. They were not saying the site was unworthy of investigation. Several of them said the opposite, that the site deserved serious, properly funded, methodologically rigorous excavation, and that it was frustrating that this had not happened. What they were objecting to was the jump from genuinely interesting anomaly to dramatic conclusion. The way Hancock's popular presentation of the site tended to replace careful uncertainty with confident assertion. And there is something else worth noting, something that gets a little lost in the back and forth between Hancock's supporters and his critics. The attention his books brought to Poompuhar was not without effect. In the years after Underworld was published, the site received more public interest than it had ever had before. More people knew it existed, more people were asking questions about it. Whether that attention helped or complicated the cause of proper scientific investigation is genuinely debatable. On one hand, public interest can drive funding and political will. On the other, a site that has become associated with a controversial popular writer Arguing for lost civilizations can be harder for mainstream institutions to engage with seriously, because any investigation risks being seen as either confirming or refuting a narrative that the investigators would rather not be associated with at all. That is not a comfortable position for a research institution to be in, and it may have contributed to the slow pace of serious follow-up work at the site. Hancock himself has continued to argue for Poompuhar's significance in the years since Underworld. He returned to the theme in later books and in media appearances, and the site appears in the Netflix documentary series Ancient Apocalypse, which he presented in 2022, where the submerged structures off the Tamil Nadu coast are again offered as evidence for his broader thesis. That series generated enormous viewership and renewed controversy in roughly equal measure. The academic response to Ancient Apocalypse was even sharper than the response to Underworld, with several professional archaeologists publicly criticising what they described as misrepresentation of the evidence. Hancock's supporters argued that the criticism was institutional defensiveness. The argument continues, loudly, in comment sections and academic journals and podcasts and everywhere else these conversations happen now. What gets a little buried in all of this, in the noise of the debate between Hancock's enthusiastic audience and his frustrated critics, is the actual site. The actual structure, at 23 metres depth, 5 kilometres offshore, 40 metres across, unexcavated, undated, genuinely unresolved. It does not care about the argument being conducted on its behalf. It sits on the seafloor of the Bay of Bengal in poor visibility and strong currents, waiting for someone to look at it carefully enough to say something definitive. That has not happened yet, and the controversy around Hancock's claims, whatever one thinks of them, has not made that careful investigation any easier to organise or fund. The honest position, stripped of both enthusiasm and dismissal, is something like this. Graham Hancock identified a genuinely interesting site and brought it to global attention. His interpretation of that site goes well beyond what the available evidence supports. His dating arguments are plausible in the loosest sense but are not established by the data. His claim that the deep structure is man-made is possible but unproven. His broader argument about a lost prehistoric civilization may or may not be true, but Poompuhar alone does not prove it. What Poompuhar does do, even in the absence of Hancock's interpretation, is pose a real question. There is something at 23 metres depth that has a shape worth explaining. The geology of the site is consistent with the possibility that this land was above water thousands of years before the historically known Poompuhar existed. Those two facts together are enough to make the site scientifically interesting without any additional narrative layered on top. The problem is that interesting is not the same as understood, and the gap between those two things, between the interesting anomaly and the understood site, is precisely where the science of sea level change and coastal geology becomes important. Because to have any real conversation about what the deep structure at Poompuhar might be and when it might have been built, you first need to understand what the coastline of Tamil Nadu actually looked like during the periods in question, how the sea level changed, how quickly, and what the local factors were that shaped the specific coastline around the Kaveri River Delta. That is not a simple question, but it is an answerable one, at least in broad terms, and the answers are genuinely illuminating, regardless of what one thinks about Graham Hancock or his conclusions. So let us slow down and actually look at the geology, not as a way of settling the argument, but as a way of understanding what the argument is really about. The story of sea level change is one of the stranger and more humbling chapters in earth science, not because it is complicated in an impenetrable way, but because the scale of it is so difficult to fully absorb. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, enormous quantities of water that would normally cycle between ocean and atmosphere were locked up in ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of North America. The Fennoscandian sheet covered northern Europe. Ice spread across parts of Asia, South America, and the high ranges of every continent. And because all of that water was frozen on land rather than sitting in the ocean basins, global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today, The best current estimates put the difference at somewhere between 100 and 120 metres. Not centimetres, not a few metres, 100 metres or more. The ocean floor that is now submerged under 100 metres of water was, at that time, dry land. To try to picture what that means for a specific coastline, consider the Bay of Bengal. Today the coast of Tamil Nadu runs roughly north to south, with the sea beginning almost immediately at the shoreline. 20,000 years ago, that coastline would have been significantly further east, out into what is now open water. The shallow continental shelf of the Bay of Bengal would have been exposed, a broad coastal plain extending perhaps dozens of kilometres beyond the modern shore. The Kaveri River, which today reaches the sea near the modern town of Poompuhar, would have flowed much further before meeting the ocean. The river mouth, the delta, the beaches, the coastal settlements, all of it would have been situated well to the east of where they are now. This is not a speculative claim. It is standard quaternary geology, the study of the Earth's most recent geological period and the dramatic environmental changes it encompasses. The broad outline of sea level change during and after the last ice age is well established through multiple independent lines of evidence. Coral reef records from the tropics, sediment cores from ocean floors, isotopic analysis of ancient shells, and the mapping of drowned river valleys and submerged coastlines all point to the same general picture. The ocean was lower, the land was larger, and then the ice began to melt. The melting was not a smooth, gradual, steady process. It happened in pulses, with periods of relatively slow change interrupted by episodes of rapid rise. One of the most significant of these events, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago and may have raised global sea levels by as much as 20 metres in a geologically short period, possibly a few centuries. Another pulse, meltwater. Pulse 1b is thought to have occurred around 11,500 years ago. Between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea levels rose quickly and persistently, inundating coastal lowlands across the world. By about 7,000 years ago, global sea levels had reached something close to their modern position, though the precise timing varied by region due to local factors. For the Tamil Nadu coastline specifically, the picture is broadly consistent with the global record, but it has local complications. One of them is tectonic activity. The Indian subcontinent is not geologically static. The crust in this region has experienced subsidence in some areas, meaning the land itself has slowly sunk over geological time, which would compound the effect of rising sea levels. If the land was subsiding at the same time the sea was rising, the effective rate of coastal inundation would have been faster than sea level rise alone would suggest. Estimating the rate and extent of this local subsidence is not straightforward, and the numbers in the scientific literature vary. But the general point is that the Tamil Nadu coast has likely lost land to the sea through a combination of rising water and sinking ground. There is also the question of sedimentation. River deltas are dynamic environments. The Kaveri River has been depositing sediment at its mouth for thousands of years, building up the delta, shifting channels and altering the local coastal geography. Sediment deposition can raise the seafloor over time, which affects the depth at which submerged features are found and complicates attempts to date when a given area was last above water. A feature found at a certain depth today might have been at a different effective depth relative to sea level when it was first covered, depending on how much sediment has accumulated since then. With all of that context in mind, what does a depth of 23 metres actually imply for the deep structure at Poompuhar? The honest answer is that it implies a range, not a single date. If you take the global sea level curves and apply them to this region, a depth of 23 metres below the current sea surface would have been at or near the waterline somewhere between roughly 11,000 and 7,000 years ago. The lower end of that range, around 11,000 years ago, corresponds to the period just after Meltwater Pulse 1b, when sea levels were rising rapidly. The upper end, around 7,000 years ago, corresponds to the period when sea levels in this region were approaching their modern position. If you factor in local tectonic subsidence, the date when that surface was last exposed could be pushed toward the more recent end of the range, since subsidence would mean the land was sinking even as the sea was rising, potentially covering it sooner than the global sea level curve alone would suggest. So a rough working range, based on the geology, is somewhere between 7,000 and 11,000 years ago. That is when the land surface, now sitting at 23 metres depth off the Poompuhar coast, was most plausibly last above water. To give that range some context, 7,000 years ago is roughly 5,000 BCE. That is around the time of early agricultural settlements in the Indus Valley region, well before the Indus Valley civilization reached its peak, and roughly contemporaneous with some of the earliest known urban settlements in Mesopotamia. 11,000 years ago is roughly 9,000 BCE, which predates almost everything we conventionally associate with settled human civilization. Göbekli Tepe in present-day Turkey, one of the oldest known monumental structures in the world, was being built around this time, though it is now thought to have begun somewhat earlier, around 9,600 BCE. Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest known proto-urban settlements, dates to around 7,500 BCE, which falls within the range we're discussing. If the deep structure at Poompuhar is genuinely man-made and was built when that land surface was above water, it would date to a period when humans in South Asia are not conventionally thought to have been building structured settlements of that kind. That is why the depth matters. That is why the date range matters. Not because it proves anything, but because it raises a real question about what human activity in coastal South Asia looked like during a period for which we have almost no direct evidence, partly because so much of that coastline is now underwater. It is worth pausing on that last point for a moment, because it is easy to underestimate how much coastal evidence from this period is simply gone. The coastlines of the world during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, the period from roughly 20,000 to 7,000 years ago, were not where they are today. They were out on the continental shelves, in areas that are now submerged under tens or hundreds of meters of water. If early human populations in South Asia, like early human populations everywhere, tended to settle near coastlines and rivers, as there is good reason to think they did, then a significant portion of their settlements would now be underwater. The archaeological record for this period in coastal South Asia is sparse, not necessarily because people were not there, but because the places where they lived are no longer accessible. This is a point that even mainstream archaeologists and geologists acknowledge. The submerged continental shelves of the world represent a vast and largely unexplored archaeological frontier. Survey work in the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and off the coasts of North America and Australia has already revealed submerged landscapes with evidence of past human occupation. The Indian subcontinent's extensive shallow shelf, particularly in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, is a plausible location for similar finds. The question is not whether people lived on those coasts. The question is what they built, how complex their societies were, and whether any of their structures have survived the submergence in a recognisable form. The bathymetric data near Poompuhar, meaning the detailed mapping of the seafloor depth and topography, does show a feature at approximately 23 metres that has attracted attention precisely because its shape is not obviously natural. Sonar surveys and diver observations have described it as roughly U-shaped, or horseshoe-shaped, approximately 40 metres across, with what appear to be constructed walls or raised edges. The difficulty is that shape alone is not sufficient to determine whether a feature is man-made. Natural geological processes, including differential erosion of rock formations, the collapse of coastal cliffs, the deposition and movement of sediment, and the formation of reef structures, can produce shapes that superficially resemble constructed features. Without datable material recovered from the structure itself, without stratigraphic analysis of the surrounding sediment, and without a detailed examination of the construction material, it is genuinely not possible to say with confidence whether this feature is a building, a wall, a harbour structure, or something entirely natural that happens to have an interesting shape. What the geology does do is establish that the depth is consistent with human occupation during a plausible period. It does not rule the structure out. The sea level history of the Tamil Nadu coast is entirely compatible with the idea that there was dry land at this location somewhere between 7 and 11,000 years ago. If people were living in this region at that time, and there is no particular reason to think they were not, they could have built something there. The geology makes the story possible. It does not make it true. There is also a subtler point worth making about the rate of sea level rise and what it would have meant for people living on these coasts. The rise was not instantaneous. Even during the most rapid pulses, the change would have unfolded over human lifetimes, over generations. A coastline that retreated by several meters over the course of a century would have been perceptibly different from one generation to the next. People living near the shore would have noticed the change. They would have moved. They might have remembered. The Tamil literary tradition of Kadal, the sea-taking land, and the broader cultural memory of coastal inundation preserved in Sangam literature may reflect exactly this kind of generational experience, compressed and mythologized over thousands of years of oral transmission, but rooted in something real that people witnessed and survived. That is a careful claim, and it is worth being careful about it. Cultural memory is not a direct record. Oral traditions transform over centuries. Stories about floods and sea swallowing are common across many cultures worldwide, and not all of them necessarily refer to specific historical events. But the specificity of some Tamil flood traditions, the references to particular places, particular festivals, particular divine actors, does suggest that some of these narratives may encode memories of real events rather than being purely symbolic or cosmological. The geology at least makes those events plausible. Whether the stories actually preserve memory of them is a different question, one that cannot be answered by bathymetric data alone. What the sea level science ultimately gives us is a frame, a geological frame within which the Poompuhar story makes sense as a possibility. The coastline was further out. The land at 23 metres was above water during a period when humans were present in South Asia. The sea rose and covered it. Something is there. Those facts taken together are genuinely interesting. They are not proof of anything specific, but they are not nothing either. They define the space within which a real discovery could exist if someone were ever to look carefully enough. And that brings us to the question of what has actually been found and how carefully it has been examined. Because the sea level science tells us when the land might have been above water, but it cannot tell us what was on it. For that, you have to go back to the actual survey work, the reports, the diver observations, and the documented finds from both the shallow and the deep parts of the site. The shallow finds are, in some ways, the clearer part of the story. They are better documented, better described, and easier to interpret within a known historical framework. But they also raise their own questions about what they actually represent, and how they relate to the deeper anomaly that sits further offshore and further down, where the water is darker and the visibility is worse and the answers are harder to reach. So let us stay with the shallow finds for a moment, because they deserve more careful attention than they sometimes receive. When the deeper anomaly gets discussed, particularly in the more popular accounts, the shallower structures tend to get folded into the same dramatic narrative, treated as supporting evidence for an ancient lost civilization rather than examined on their own terms. But the shallow finds are actually the better documented part of this story, and they tell a genuinely interesting chapter of their own, even if it is a somewhat different chapter than the one some accounts suggest. The National Institute of Oceanography conducted a series of underwater surveys in the waters off Poompuhar across the 1990s and into the early 2000s. These were systematic surveys, not casual dives, and they produced published reports. The work was led and contributed to by researchers including S.R. Rao, one of India's most respected marine archaeologists, the same person who had earlier documented submerged structures off the coast of Dwarka in Gujarat. The findings from the Poompuhar surveys were real, specific, and documented in ways that allow them to be evaluated. At depths ranging from roughly 1 to 4 meters, divers recovered and documented a range of artifacts and structural remains. Terracotta figurines were found, some of them depicting human forms, some animal. Copper coins were recovered, and while coins can shift and travel in underwater environments, their presence in this zone is consistent with a historically active coastal settlement. Brick structures were identified, with construction patterns that could be examined and compared to known building traditions from the region. Pottery sherds were collected, and while underwater pottery is notoriously difficult to date precisely without controlled excavation, the types of ware identified were consistent with the broader Chola period material culture known from onshore sites in Tamil Nadu. None of this is surprising for a site where a historically documented city once stood. The shallow finds, taken together, look like what you would expect to find if you went looking for the remains of a prosperous ancient port that had been gradually submerged by a combination of sea level rise, coastal erosion, and possibly subsidence. They look, in other words, like Poompuhar, the historically known Poompuhar, the city described in Sangam literature, the Chola-era capital, the port that traded in pearls and spices and fine cloth with merchants who came from Rome and Southeast Asia. The finds in the 1 to 4 meter zone are consistent with a city that existed within the last 2,000 years or so and was gradually claimed by the sea. That is already a remarkable thing. A documented ancient city, partially submerged, with physical remains still visible on the seafloor. That alone would make Poompuhar a site of considerable archaeological interest. Then there is the horseshoe-shaped structure at 5 to 6 meters depth. This is the feature that sits between the shallow finds and the deeper anomaly, and it has attracted its own share of attention and debate. The NIO surveys described it as roughly 20 meters across, constructed from what appeared to be stone rather than brick, and shaped in a way that does not obviously match the natural coastal topography of the area. Its function has been debated. Some researchers have suggested it might be a granary, the kind of large storage structure that a busy port city would require to hold goods waiting for loading or distribution. Others have proposed it could be a ritual structure, perhaps connected to the coastal religious practices described in the Sangam texts, where the sea was venerated and festivals were held at the shore. A third possibility is that it represents some kind of harbour feature, a breakwater element or a structural support for a dock or jetty. None of these interpretations has been confirmed, because the structure has not been excavated in any controlled or systematic way. What has been done is surface observation, photographic documentation, and general measurement. That is useful, but it is not the same as excavation. Without excavation, you cannot determine construction sequence, you cannot recover datable organic material from foundation layers, and you cannot establish with confidence whether the structure is a single-phase construction or something that was built, modified, and rebuilt over time. What can be said is that the structure's dimensions and construction material are broadly consistent with the kind of architecture known from Chola period sites on shore. The early Chola builders used stone for significant civic and religious structures. A 20-metre horseshoe structure in stone, located near the ancient harbour of a major port city, is not implausible as a Chola-era construction. If the 5 to 6 metre depth is consistent with submergence over the last 1 to 2,000 years, which the sea level data for this coastline does support as a possibility, then this structure could represent a piece of the historically known city rather than something older. That is the conservative reading, and it is a reasonable one. The problem, and this is a genuine problem in underwater archaeology generally and not unique to Poompuhar, is that dating submerged artifacts and structures is significantly harder than dating their onshore equivalents. Radiocarbon dating requires organic material, and organic material in marine environments degrades, shifts, and contaminates in ways that make results unreliable unless the sampling is very carefully controlled. Pottery typology can give broad date ranges but not precise ones. Coin finds can indicate that a site was occupied during a certain period, but a coin found on the seafloor could have been deposited at any point after it was minted, and coins were in circulation for generations. Structural analysis, comparing construction techniques and materials to known dated examples, is useful, but requires detailed examination that underwater visibility in the Bay of Bengal often makes very difficult. The water off the Tamil Nadu coast is not like the clear Mediterranean. Visibility in this part of the Bay of Bengal can drop to 1 or 2 meters, sometimes less, particularly during and after the monsoon season when sediment is stirred up and river discharge clouds the water. Working in that environment is genuinely hard. A diver trying to examine a stone structure in 1 meter of visibility, with currents pushing them sideways and sediment settling on every surface, is working under conditions that would frustrate even the most experienced underwater archaeologist. This is not an excuse for the limited documentation. It is a real constraint that has shaped what is and is not known about this site. What would be needed to properly characterize even the shallow finds is a controlled excavation program using techniques adapted for the marine environment. That would mean establishing a grid across the site, carefully removing sediment layer by layer, recording the position and depth of every artifact found, collecting samples for radiocarbon and other dating methods, and doing all of this in a systematic way that allows the results to be interpreted stratigraphically. Stratigraphy, the reading of layered sediment to understand the sequence of deposition and occupation, is the backbone of terrestrial archaeology. Underwater, it is much harder to apply, but it is not impossible. Marine archaeologists have developed methods for underwater stratigraphy, and they have been used successfully at submerged sites in the Mediterranean, in Scandinavia and elsewhere. The techniques exist. They simply have not been applied at Poompuhar in any comprehensive way. This brings up a question worth sitting with for a moment. If the shallow finds are real and documented, and if the techniques to study them more carefully exist, why has the site not been more thoroughly excavated? That is a question that leads into some complicated territory involving funding, institutional capacity, political sensitivity, and the practical challenges of the environment, and it is worth examining in its own right later. For now, it is enough to note that the shallow finds represent a credible and interesting archaeological record that has been partially documented, but not fully investigated. They are not in doubt as finds. What remains uncertain is their precise age, their precise function, and exactly how they relate to the historical city described in the Sangam texts. And then there is the question of how the shallow finds relate to the deeper anomaly. This is where the interpretive challenge becomes most acute. The shallow finds, at 1 to 6 meters depth, are almost certainly connected to the historically documented Poompuhar. They are consistent in type, material, and probable age with a Chola era or earlier historic city that was gradually submerged over the last 2,000 years or so. That is a coherent and well-supported interpretation. The deeper structure, at 23 meters and roughly 5 kilometers offshore, is a different matter entirely. The depth and distance make it unlikely to be part of the same submergence event that claimed the shallower parts of the city. The sea level data suggests that land at 23 meters was last above water somewhere between 7 and 11,000 years ago, not 2,000 years ago. If the deeper structure is man-made, it belongs to a completely different period of human history, one that predates the Chola dynasty by thousands of years, predates the Sangam literature by thousands of years, and predates the conventional archaeological record of complex settlement in South Asia by a significant margin. That is the interpretive gap that makes Poompuhar so genuinely interesting and so genuinely contested. You have 2 sets of findings at the same site that, if both are real and both are man-made, would represent human occupation separated by thousands of years. The shallow record fits neatly into what is historically known. The deep structure, if it is what some researchers have suggested, does not fit neatly into anything that is currently established. It would require a significant revision of what is understood about early human settlement and construction in South Asia. That is a large claim, and large claims require correspondingly strong evidence. The shallow finds, carefully documented and broadly consistent with known archaeology, provide that kind of evidence for the historic city. The deeper structure so far does not. The evidence for it is thinner, the documentation is less detailed, and the interpretation is more contested. That asymmetry matters. It means that the two parts of the Poompuhar story are not equally well supported, even though they are sometimes discussed as if they are equally certain. The shallow city is real. The deeper structure is real in the sense that something is there. But what that something is, how old it is, and whether it was built by human hands remains genuinely open. The shallow finds confirm that Poompuhar was a real city that was really submerged. They do not confirm the deeper claim. They are sometimes used to lend credibility to the deeper claim by suggesting that if the shallow city was submerged, why not an older city at greater depth? That logic is not unreasonable as a hypothesis. But a hypothesis supported by analogy is not the same as a hypothesis supported by evidence. The deeper structure needs its own evidence, recovered from the structure itself, before it can be interpreted with any confidence. What the shallow finds do establish, and this is worth being clear about, is that Poompuhar is a real site with real archaeology. It is not a legend dressed up as a discovery. The terracotta figurines, the brick walls, the copper coins, the horseshoe structure at 5 to 6 meters, these are documented finds from a documented survey program conducted by a credible government research institution. They are not the product of enthusiastic speculation. They represent the known recoverable past of a city that was genuinely important in its time, that traded with distant civilizations, that was celebrated in some of the oldest surviving poetry in the Tamil language, and that was eventually claimed by the sea, in a process that the sea level record confirms was real and ongoing. That is already a story worth telling carefully and completely, without needing to attach it to claims about lost civilizations from the deep ice age. The deeper structure adds another layer to that story, one that is more uncertain and more contested, but also more provocative in the best sense of that word. It raises a question that cannot yet be answered. And unanswered questions are, in their own way, as valuable as answered ones. They point toward the work that still needs to be done. They define the edge of what is known, and at Poompuhar that edge runs somewhere between the shallow brick walls, where the historic city fades into sediment, and the dark water further out where something sits at 23 meters, unexcavated and unexplained, waiting for the kind of careful, patient attention that would finally let it speak for itself. So let us spend a little more time with the deeper structure. Not to resolve it, because it cannot be resolved yet, but to understand it more clearly, to separate what has actually been reported from what has been claimed, and to think carefully about why, after several decades of interest in this site, the most important question remains unanswered. The anomaly at 23 meters depth was first noted during surveys conducted in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. It sits roughly 5 kilometers offshore from the present coastline, in water that is dark and not particularly cooperative with human visitors. The structure, as described in the reports that have been made available, is large. Estimates of its dimensions vary slightly depending on the source, but the general description is of a broad, roughly U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped formation, somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 meters across at its widest point. The walls or edges of the shape, as reported, appear to rise from the seabed with some regularity, suggesting a constructed rather than a purely geological form. That is the basic description. It sounds significant, and in some ways it is. But the details matter enormously here, and the details are where the record becomes thinner. What the sonar data shows is an anomaly in the seafloor profile. Sonar can detect changes in shape and density. It can indicate that something is there that differs from the surrounding sediment. What sonar cannot do on its own is tell you whether that something is a wall built by human hands or a natural rock formation that happens to be curved. The Bay of Bengal seafloor in this region contains geological features of its own, old river channels, sediment ridges, rock outcrops, and formations shaped by thousands of years of tidal movement and sedimentation. A curved rock formation is not impossible. A natural feature that resembles a constructed wall from a sonar image is not impossible. This is not a dismissal of the structure. It is a statement of what sonar data alone can and cannot establish. Divers have reached the structure. Graham Hancock described his dive to it in Underworld, published in 2002, and his account is vivid. He describes the experience of descending into very poor visibility, of the water growing darker and colder, of the structure emerging slowly as a presence rather than a clear image. He describes what felt to him like worked stone, like deliberate construction, like a feature that did not look natural. His account is genuinely atmospheric and worth reading. But Hancock himself is not a geologist or an archaeologist. He is a writer and a researcher with a particular interpretive framework, and his account is not a substitute for a formal scientific report. His dive description is interesting. It is not documentation in the archaeological sense. The National Institute of Oceanography has conducted surveys at this site, and their published reports are more cautious. The NIO's work in the 1990s and early 2000s, including surveys associated with S.R. Rao and his colleagues, acknowledged the presence of the deep structure and noted it as worthy of further investigation. What those reports do not do is make a definitive claim about the structure's origin or age. The language used is careful. Words like anomaly, possible structure requires further study. That kind of language is not evasion. It is what responsible researchers say when the evidence is incomplete. The NIO is a credible institution with serious scientists. When they decline to state definitively that something is man-made, that caution is meaningful, part of the reason the documentation is incomplete comes down to the environment itself. The Bay of Bengal off the Tamil Nadu coast is not a pleasant place to conduct underwater archaeology. Visibility can be extremely poor, sometimes as low as 1 or 2 meters, because of the sediment load carried by the Kaveri River and other rivers in the delta system. Sediment suspended in the water column reduces visibility dramatically and makes photographic and video documentation difficult. What little imagery has been captured from the deeper site is, by most accounts, not sharp enough to draw firm conclusions from. You're looking at shapes in murk, not clear architectural features in a well-lit pool. The currents in this region are also not trivial. The Bay of Bengal experiences significant seasonal variation in current patterns, driven by the monsoon cycle. During certain months, working at depth in this area is simply not safe. The dive windows are narrow. Even within those windows, conditions can shift. A survey team that reaches the site on a given day may find visibility of 2 meters. A team returning the following week may find visibility of half a meter. Planning a systematic excavation under those conditions is genuinely difficult, not as an excuse but as a logistical reality. Underwater archaeology under good conditions requires patience, precision, and controlled methodology. Under the conditions that prevail at this site for much of the year, achieving that level of control is a significant challenge. Then there is the matter of sedimentation. The structure at 23 meters is not sitting clean and exposed on the seafloor, it is partially buried. The sediment accumulation in this part of the Bay of Bengal has been ongoing for thousands of years, and any structure that has been sitting on the seafloor since the Holocene or earlier would be substantially covered. Excavating through marine sediment at depth requires equipment, time, and a methodology that prevents the sediment from simply flowing back into the excavation trench as fast as it is removed. It requires suction equipment, careful recording, controlled sampling, and ideally a permanent or semi-permanent presence at the site over an extended period. None of that has happened at Poompuhar's deeper structure. What has happened is a series of survey dives, some sonar passes, and a limited amount of visual observation. That is a beginning, not an investigation. The Archaeological Survey of India's official position on the deeper structure has remained cautious. The SI has acknowledged the site and the surveys, but has not formally classified the deep structure as a confirmed man-made feature. This is the kind of institutional restraint that frustrates people, who are certain the structure is ancient and important, but it is also the kind of institutional restraint that exists for good reasons. Official classification carries weight. It influences funding decisions, site protection designations, and the broader academic conversation about Indian prehistory. Classifying something incorrectly in either direction has consequences. The ASI's caution is not indifference. It is the position of an institution that understands what it does not yet know. What would actually be needed to resolve the question is fairly clear, even if achieving it is not simple. First, a proper sub-bottom profiling survey, which uses acoustic signals to image what lies beneath the sediment surface, would help establish the structure's full dimensions and depth of burial. This kind of survey can sometimes distinguish between geological and constructed features based on the regularity and orientation of buried surfaces. Second, controlled excavation of a small area within or adjacent to the structure using appropriate underwater tools would allow for the recovery of datable material. If the structure is man-made, there is a reasonable chance that organic material, charcoal, wood, bone, plant fibre, could be found in association with it. Carbon-14 dating of such material would give an age estimate, though with the usual caveats about marine reservoir effects and contamination that complicate underwater radiocarbon dating. Third, a detailed petrographic analysis of the stone or material composing the structure would help determine whether it is natural rock from the local geology or whether it has been worked, shaped, or transported from elsewhere. Worked stone looks different from unworked stone under close examination, and the presence of tool marks, regular surfaces, or non-local material would be significant evidence. None of this is beyond the reach of modern underwater archaeology. It is the kind of work that has been done at other submerged sites around the world, including some in considerably more challenging conditions. The fact that it has not been done at Poompuhar's deeper site is not a scientific impossibility. It is a combination of funding constraints, institutional priorities, logistical difficulties, and the particular political sensitivity that surrounds this site, which we'll come back to later in this story. The absence of proper investigation is frustrating, but it is also, in a strange way, what keeps the question open. You cannot dismiss what has not been properly examined. The deep structure has not been proven to be man-made. It has also not been proven to be natural. It sits in that uncomfortable middle space where genuine uncertainty lives. What makes the situation particularly interesting is that there is no obvious reason why a natural rock formation of this shape and size would be sitting at this location on the seafloor. That does not mean there is no natural explanation. Geology produces remarkable shapes, and the seafloor is full of features that look improbable from a human perspective. But the combination of the shape, the location near a historically documented coastal city, the sea level data suggesting this area was above water during the period of early human habitation in South Asia, and the presence of the shallow documented structures nearby all create a context in which the possibility of a man-made origin deserves to be taken seriously. Taking something seriously and claiming it as proven are very different things, and that distinction matters here more than almost anywhere else in this story. There is also the question of what the structure's function might have been, assuming for a moment that it is man-made. The horseshoe or U-shape has been interpreted in various ways. Some have suggested it could be a harbour feature, a kind of protective seawall or breakwater that would have sheltered small boats from the open sea. Others have proposed it might be a ritual structure, perhaps a platform or enclosure used for ceremonial purposes near the water. Still others have suggested it could be a granary or storage facility of some kind. All of these interpretations are speculative, and none of them can be evaluated without knowing more about the structure's construction material, internal features, associated finds, and relationship to any other features in the surrounding area. The shape alone does not tell you the function. It tells you there is a shape. Everything else is inference. What the deeper structure does do, regardless of its ultimate nature, is pose a question that the shallow evidence cannot answer. The shallow finds tell us about the historic Poompuhar, the Chola-era port city that traded with Rome and was celebrated in Tamil verse. They tell us that city was real and that it was submerged. The deeper structure asks whether something else was also there, much earlier, before the sea rose to cover it. That question cannot be answered by analogy with the shallow city. It cannot be answered by literary texts, however ancient. It cannot be answered by sea level charts or sonar images alone. It can only be answered by going down there carefully, with the right tools, and looking at what is actually present with the kind of systematic attention that the site has not yet received. Until that happens, the deeper structure will remain what it has been since it was first noted, a genuine anomaly in an already remarkable location, sitting at the edge of what is known and what is not, in dark water, under sediment, waiting. There is something almost fitting about that. A site associated with a city that ancient poets said was swallowed by the sea, sitting beneath the sea, still not fully seen. The image is almost too neat. But the archaeology does not care about neat images. It cares about evidence. And the evidence from the deep site, such as it is, remains incomplete, ambiguous, and in need of the kind of serious, sustained, well-resourced investigation that would finally let the structure speak for itself, rather than being spoken for by everyone who has an opinion about what it means. That is the honest state of the deeper anomaly at Poompuhar. Not proven, not dismissed, partially observed, inadequately documented, genuinely uncertain. And that uncertainty, frustrating as it is also what makes the site worth continuing to think about. Because somewhere in the scientific gap between what has been observed and what has been properly investigated, there is a real answer waiting. Whether that answer confirms the most dramatic interpretation or deflates it, it would be an answer. And answers about the deep human past are always worth having. The Poompuhar story does not exist in isolation, though. There are other submerged sites, other coastlines, other underwater anomalies that have generated similar questions and similar debates. Looking at those sites alongside Poompuhar helps put the whole picture in better perspective, and it turns out that the phenomenon of cities and settlements lost to rising seas is far more widespread than most people realise. Poompuhar is not the only place where the sea has swallowed something that people once lived in. That is worth saying plainly, because one of the things that can distort our thinking about any single submerged site is treating it as if it were an isolated anomaly, as if the ocean swallowing a coastal settlement was some unusual or improbable event requiring special explanation. It is not. The sea has been claiming land for as long as sea levels have been rising, and sea levels have been rising, with occasional interruptions and reversals, for the better part of 20,000 years. The coastlines of the world today are not the coastlines of the ancient world. They are not even close. The land that humans have lived on, built on, fished from, farmed, buried their dead in, and told stories about stretches far beyond the current shoreline in almost every direction. Most of it is now underwater. The real question about any submerged site is never whether submergence happened. It is when and what was there when it did. The most frequently cited comparison in discussions of Poompuhar is Dwarka, the submerged site off the northwestern coast of India in the Gulf of Kambat, in the state of Gujarat. Dwarka is significant in Hindu tradition as the legendary city of Krishna, and when underwater structures were found near the modern town of Dwarka in the 1980s and 1990s, it generated enormous attention, both scholarly and popular. The National Institute of Oceanography, the same organisation involved in the Poompuhar surveys, conducted extensive work there. What they found was more substantial in some respects than what has been documented at Poompuhar's shallow site. Stone anchors, pottery, structural remains, and what appear to be defensive walls or city walls have been identified at depths ranging from roughly 5 to 12 metres. The NIO's surveys in the 1980s and early 1990s, led in part by S.R. Rao, produced documented evidence of a structured settlement, and the findings were published in peer-reviewed contexts which gave them a level of credibility that the Poompuhar deep site has not yet achieved. The dating of the Dwarka places them broadly in the late Harappan or post-Harappan period, somewhere in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, which is significant but not as dramatically ancient as the claims sometimes made for Poompuhar's deeper structure. Still, Dwarka demonstrates something important. Underwater archaeology on the Indian coastline is possible. It has produced real results, and those results can be documented and published in a way that withstands at least some level of scrutiny. The Gulf of Kambat, also called the Gulf of Cambay, produced a separate and considerably more contested discovery in 2001. A team from the National Institute of Ocean Technology, using side-scan sonar during a routine pollution survey, detected what appeared to be large geometric structures on the seafloor at depths of around 30 to 40 metres. The structures were described as organised in a pattern suggesting a large settlement, with what looked like streets, buildings and a riverbed running through the site. Artefacts were dredged from the area, including what was reported to be a human tooth and fragments of pottery and worked wood. Carbon dating of some of the organic material produced dates that, if accurate, would place the site at roughly 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, making it potentially one of the oldest known structured settlements in the world. The discovery was announced at a press conference by the Indian government with considerable fanfare, and it made international headlines. The academic response, however, was sceptical, and in some cases sharply critical. The main objections were methodological. Dredging artefacts from a seafloor does not tell you where those artefacts came from stratigraphically. Objects can be transported by currents, deposited by rivers, or mixed together from completely different time periods by the action of the water. The sonar images, while interesting, were not considered definitive evidence of man-made structures by most underwater archaeologists who reviewed them. The human tooth's dating was questioned on the grounds that contamination in marine environments can produce unreliable radiocarbon results. The site has not been properly excavated, and the initial claims have not been independently confirmed to the satisfaction of mainstream archaeology. The Gulf of Kambat discovery remains in a state of genuine dispute, somewhere between intriguing anomaly and overinterpreted sonar data, depending on who you ask. It is mentioned here not because it proves anything about Poompuhar, but because it illustrates how the same pattern repeats. Something is found, claims are made, the evidence turns out to be less clear than the announcement suggested, and the scientific community is left waiting for proper investigation that takes years or decades to materialise, if it happens at all. Further afield, the Yonaguni monument off the southern tip of Japan's Ryukyu Islands has generated a similar cycle of discovery, excitement, interpretation, and unresolved debate. The structure was first noted by a diver named Kihachiro Arataki in 1986, and it consists of what appears to be a large step stone platform, roughly 60 metres wide and about 27 metres tall, sitting at depths of between 5 and 40 metres. It has flat surfaces, what look like right angles, terraced levels, and what some observers have described as carved features. The site attracted considerable international attention, and some researchers argued it was a man-made structure dating to a time when the area was above sea level, which based on the depth would be roughly 10,000 years ago or more. Others, including a number of geologists, argued that the structure is entirely natural, the result of the way the local sandstone fractures along flat planes and right angles due to its crystalline structure. The debate has not been definitively resolved. The geological argument is strong, because sandstone genuinely does produce remarkably regular shapes in some conditions. But the site is unusual enough that serious researchers have not dismissed it entirely. Yonaguni is not Poompuhar, and the geological context is quite different. But it belongs to the same family of questions. How do we distinguish a man-made underwater structure from a natural formation that happens to look organised? The broader phenomenon of submerged coastal settlements is not confined to Asia. It is global, and in some parts of the world it is extremely well documented. The North Sea, for example, was not always a sea. During the last glacial maximum and for thousands of years afterward, a large area of what is now the floor of the North Sea was dry land. This region is called Doggerland by archaeologists, and it was a substantial landmass connecting what is now Britain to what is now the Netherlands, Denmark and northern Germany. Doggerland was inhabited by Mesolithic people who hunted, fished and lived there for thousands of years. As sea levels rose after the last ice age, Doggerland was gradually inundated. Fishing trawlers have pulled up mammoth bones, antler tools, and human remains from the North Sea floor for well over a century. In recent decades, systematic underwater archaeological surveys have produced detailed maps of the ancient landscape, including river systems, lakes, and what appear to be habitation sites. Doggerland is perhaps the clearest demonstration anywhere in the world that inhabited land can be thoroughly submerged by rising sea levels on a timescale relevant to human history, and that the evidence can survive if conditions are right. In the Mediterranean, the evidence is similarly rich. The ancient Greek city of Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of the Peloponnese, is one of the best documented submerged settlements in the world. It was identified in 1967 and has been systematically surveyed and mapped since then, most comprehensively in a major project beginning in 2009. Pavlopetri appears to date to the Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, and it includes streets, buildings, courtyards, and what appear to be cult buildings, all sitting in about 3 to 4 meters of water. It was submerged by a combination of sea level rise and tectonic subsidence, which lowered the land relative to the sea. Pavlopetri is important not because it is the oldest submerged settlement, but because it demonstrates what is possible when proper archaeological methods are applied to an underwater site. Detailed mapping, photogrammetry, controlled sampling, and careful artifact documentation have produced a picture of the city that is genuinely informative. The contrast with the situation at Poompuhar, where the deep structure has been observed but not systematically investigated, is instructive. Off the coast of Israel, the submerged Neolithic village of Atlit Yam was found in the 1980s, in about 8 to 12 meters of water near the modern town of Atlit. It dates to roughly 9,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known submerged settlements in the world. It contains stone-built houses, a well, a ritual structure consisting of 7 large stones arranged in a semicircle, and the remains of the people who lived there, including skeletons showing evidence of tuberculosis, which is one of the earliest known cases of the disease. Atlit Yam is extraordinary because it is so well preserved and so well documented. The site was submerged relatively quickly, which helped preserve organic material that would normally decay. It shows that 9,000-year-old coastal settlements can survive underwater in a recognisable and datable form if conditions are favourable. It also shows that the age range being discussed for Poompuhar's deeper structure, roughly 9,000 to 11,000 years ago, is not inherently implausible as a period of human coastal settlement. People were living in permanent structured communities at the edge of the sea at that time. Atlit Yam is the proof. What all of these sites together suggest is that the question being asked about Poompuhar is a legitimate scientific question. Is there a submerged settlement of significant age off the Tamil Nadu coast? That is not a fringe question. It is the kind of question that has produced real answers at Pavlopetri, at Atlit Yam, at Dwarka, and at sites in Croatia, Turkey, Egypt, and along the coasts of Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, where submerged Paleo-Indian sites have been found and documented. The global record of submerged coastal settlements is extensive, and it keeps growing as underwater survey technology improves. The existence of such sites is not remarkable. The remarkable thing would be if a densely populated, historically well-documented coastline like the Tamil Nadu coast had no submerged settlements at all. The specific context of the Indian subcontinent's coastline adds another layer to this. The Bay of Bengal coast of southern India is one of the most geologically active coastlines in Asia. It has experienced not only global sea level rise, but also local tectonic movement, subsidence, and the effects of major seismic events, including the catastrophic 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which temporarily exposed some structures near Mahabalipuram that had not been seen in living memory. After the tsunami receded, people reported seeing stone structures and what appeared to be carved surfaces briefly visible in the shallow water before they were covered again by sand. The ASI conducted surveys in the area in 2005 and found evidence of submerged structures, though the findings were modest compared to some of the early reports. The episode was a reminder that the Tamil Nadu coastline has a complex geological history, and that the sea here has been actively reshaping the land for a very long time. The comparison with other submerged sites also helps clarify what Poompuhar is and is not. It is not the only submerged site in India. It is not the only disputed underwater anomaly in Asia. It is not the deepest, the largest, or the most extensively documented submerged site in the world. What makes it distinctive is the combination of factors that come together here in a way that is unusual. The richness of the textual tradition describing the city, the presence of documented shallow finds consistent with the historical city, the deeper anomaly at 23 metres that cannot be explained by the same historical period, and the sea level data suggesting that the area around the deeper structure was above water during a period when humans in South Asia were already living in organised communities. No single one of these factors is sufficient on its own. Together, they create a picture that is genuinely worth taking seriously. There is also something worth noting about the way submerged sites tend to be discovered and investigated. The pattern is remarkably consistent across different countries and different time periods. An anomaly is detected, often accidentally, by fishermen, divers, or sonar surveys conducted for other purposes. Initial reports attract attention and sometimes exaggerated claims. A period of debate follows, often contentious, in which the evidence is disputed and the methodology criticised. Gradually, if the site is important enough and the institutional will exists, proper archaeological investigation begins, and the picture slowly becomes clearer. Pavlo Petri followed this arc over several decades. Atlit Yam followed it. Dwaka followed a version of it. Poompuhar is somewhere in the middle of this arc, past the initial discovery and the first wave of controversy, but not yet at the stage of systematic, well-resourced investigation that would produce definitive answers. The arc is not complete. The story is still in progress. And the story of Poompuhar is complicated by something that most other submerged sites do not have to the same degree: the weight of cultural memory. The city is not just an archaeological site. It is a living presence in Tamil literature, Tamil identity, and Tamil cultural consciousness. That weight shapes how the site is discussed, who invests in investigating it, what conclusions people hope to find, and what conclusions they resist. Understanding that dimension of the story is essential to understanding why the archaeology has proceeded the way it has, and why the gap between what is known and what could be known has remained so wide for so long. The cultural memory of Poompuhar is not a separate story from the archaeology. It is woven through it, influencing it at every turn, and it deserves its own careful consideration. That cultural memory runs deep. Deeper, in some ways, than the water now covering the city itself. And to understand why Poompuhar has never quite faded from Tamil consciousness, you have to understand something about the nature of Sangam literature and what it meant for a civilization to record its losses in verse. The Sangam period, roughly spanning the 3rd century BCE to the 3rd century CE, produced some of the oldest surviving literature in any Indian language. The poems collected in anthologies like the Akana Nuru, the Purana Nuru, and the Patinapalai are not mythological texts in the conventional sense. They are observational, personal, sometimes surprisingly plain in their language. They describe real places, real weather, real human emotions. They talk about the smell of the sea at a particular harbour, the sound of cartwheels on a particular street, the way a particular festival looked when the lamps were lit along a particular shore. When these poems mention Kavrepatinam, they are not speaking in abstractions. They are describing a place that the poets knew, or that people around them had known, with a specificity that carries the weight of actual memory. The epic Silapatikaram, attributed to the prince poet Ilango Adigal, is set largely in Kavarapattinam and uses the city as both a physical setting and an emotional anchor. The streets have names in the poem. The neighbourhoods are distinguished by the trades practised in them. There is a harbour district, a district for musicians and dancers, a district for merchants, a district for the wealthy. The sea is not a vague backdrop. It is a presence with its own character, its own moods, its own relationship to the city. And the poem does not end with the city thriving. It ends with loss, with grief, with the sea taking what the land could not hold. The Manimekalai, which serves as a kind of sequel to the Silapatikaram, is even more explicit about the flooding. It describes the sea rising over the city, swallowing the festival grounds, the temples, the streets. The language is dramatic and theological. The flood is framed as a consequence of neglected ritual, of divine displeasure with the Indravija festival that had been allowed to lapse. But the physical description underneath the theological framing is coherent and specific. The water comes. The city goes under. What had been a living place becomes a memory. Tamil scholars have debated for generations how much of this to read as historical record and how much as literary convention. The honest answer is probably both at once. Ancient poets did not always distinguish between the literal and the symbolic in the way a modern historian might prefer. But they also did not invent the physical world they described. When a poet describes a specific harbour with a specific lighthouse and specific goods being traded on specific docks, and then describes that harbour being swallowed by the sea, the most natural reading is that something real happened, even if the theological explanation layered over it is the poet's own interpretation of why. The Tamil concept of Kadal Kol, which translates roughly as the sea taking the land, appears not just in connection with Poompuhar, but as a recurring motif in Tamil cultural memory. The idea that the sea has repeatedly claimed Tamil land, that the current coastline is only the most recent edge of a much older and larger Tamil world, is not a fringe belief in Tamil culture. It is woven into the tradition, and it connects to the much larger and much more contested narrative of Kumari Kandam, the legendary submerged landmass said to have once extended far south of the current tip of India into what is now the Indian Ocean. Kumari Kandam is a complicated subject, and it deserves careful handling. In its most moderate form, it is a cultural memory of the fact that the Indian subcontinent's coastline was significantly larger during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower, and that this larger landmass was gradually submerged as the ice melted. That part is geologically real. The coastline of southern India did extend further south and east during the last glacial maximum. There was more land. People may have lived on it. Some of it is now under water. In that sense, the broad outlines of the Kumari Kandam narrative have a plausible geological basis. But Kumari Kandam has also been developed, particularly in the 20th century and into the 21st, into a much more expansive claim. That it was the original homeland of Tamil civilization, that the first Tamil Sangam academies were held there, that Tamil is the world's oldest language and the source of all human civilization, and that the submergence of this landmass represents a catastrophic loss that has been unjustly ignored by mainstream scholarship. This version of the narrative has become entangled with Tamil nationalism, with political arguments about the antiquity and distinctiveness of Tamil culture, and with a broader resistance to what some Tamil intellectuals perceive as the marginalisation of Tamil history within Indian national narratives. The political dimension is real and it matters, not because it invalidates the underlying questions about submerged sites, but because it shapes the environment in which those questions are investigated. When a site like Poompuhar becomes a symbol in a cultural and political argument about civilizational priority, the pressure on archaeologists and institutions becomes complicated in ways that are hard to separate from the science. There is pressure from one direction to confirm the ancient claims, to find the evidence that proves Tamil civilization is as old and as significant as the tradition says. There is pressure from another direction, often from within academic institutions, to be cautious about findings that could be used to support nationalist narratives that have sometimes been associated with ethnic tensions and political conflict in South Asia. Neither of these pressures is good for archaeology. Good archaeology requires patience, methodological rigour, willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, and freedom from the expectation that the findings will confirm a predetermined conclusion. When a site is loaded with cultural and political meaning before a single, controlled excavation has been completed, all of those conditions become harder to maintain, and yet the cultural memory itself, separate from the political uses to which it has been put, is not nothing. It is not simply noise to be filtered out before the real scientific work can begin. Cultural memory is a form of evidence, imperfect and indirect, but real. The fact that Tamil literary tradition has preserved a detailed and consistent memory of a great city at the mouth of the Kaveri River that was swallowed by the sea, and that this memory has been maintained across 2,000 years of continuous literary production, is meaningful. It does not prove that the deeper underwater structure is man-made. It does not confirm any particular date. But it tells us something about what people who lived near this coastline believed had happened, and it suggests that the belief was grounded in something more than pure invention. The modern town of Poompuhar, which sits on the Tamil Nadu coast roughly 300 kilometres south of Chennai, is a quiet place. The population is modest, a few thousand people. There is a beach, a small museum maintained by the Tamil Nadu government, a shore temple, and a lighthouse. The museum contains artefacts recovered from the area, including some of the pottery and terracotta figurines recovered from the shallow underwater surveys. It is a careful, modest collection, not grandiose, not claiming more than the evidence supports. The building itself is not large. On a quiet afternoon you could walk through it in less than an hour. But the town holds its history in a way that is hard to miss if you are paying attention. The name itself was restored in 1984, when the town was officially renamed from Kavaripattinam back to Poompuhar, a deliberate act of cultural reclamation. The name Poompuhar means something like City of Flowers or City of Fragrance in Tamil, and its restoration was a statement about identity as much as a geographical designation. The Kaveri River still meets the sea here, at the same delta it has occupied for millennia. Though the river's flow has changed considerably due to upstream dams and water management, the delta is quieter now than it once was. The harbour that once received ships from Rome and Southeast Asia is long gone, but the place persists. The annual rituals connected to the sea here have a particular character. Fishermen in the area perform ceremonies at the water's edge that carry echoes of much older practices, offerings to the sea, prayers for safe passage, acknowledgements of what the water has taken and what it might still hold. These are not theatrical reenactments for tourists. They are living practices, passed down through families, maintained by communities that have lived on this coast for generations. Whether or not those communities can trace a direct line back to the Chola-era city, they carry the idea of it with them. The sea here is not just geography, it is history. There is something worth sitting with in the way that Poompuhar has been remembered. 2,000 years is a long time for a city to stay present in a culture's consciousness. Most cities that disappear do so quietly, their names fading from use, their stories absorbed into the general background noise of history, surviving only in dusty records that few people read. Poompuhar did not disappear that way. It stayed in the poetry, it stayed in the epics, it stayed in the name of the town, even when the name was officially changed and then officially restored. It stayed in the rituals at the water's edge. It stayed in the arguments about Kumari Kandam and Tamil antiquity, even when those arguments became politically complicated. That persistence is itself a kind of data. It tells us that the loss of this city, or whatever it was that was lost here, was significant enough to leave a mark that 2 millennia of subsequent history could not erase. Whether the loss was the flooding of a Chola-era port city sometime in the first millennium CE, or the much older submergence of a settlement that predates the historical record entirely, or some combination of both accumulated into a single cultural memory of the sea taking the land, something happened here that people felt the need to remember. The difficulty, of course, is that cultural memory is not a precise instrument. It preserves the emotional truth of an event more reliably than its factual details. A flood that destroyed a beloved city would be remembered as catastrophic, as divine punishment, as a wound in the cultural body, regardless of whether it happened 300 years ago or 3,000. The emotional register of the memory does not tell us the date. The specificity of the literary descriptions does not tell us the depth. The persistence of the tradition does not tell us the age of the structures now lying on the floor of the Bay of Bengal. What the cultural memory does tell us is why this site matters to the people who live near it, and to the broader Tamil-speaking world. It tells us why the question of what is down there is not just an archaeological question, but a question with layers of meaning that archaeology alone cannot fully address. It tells us why the investigation of this site has been shaped by forces that go beyond funding and logistics, why the findings have been interpreted through lenses that are not purely scientific, and why the gap between what is known and what is claimed has been so persistent and so difficult to close. Understanding that gap and the cultural forces that have contributed to it is not a distraction from the archaeology. It is part of the full picture of what Poompuhar is. The city exists in at least two registers simultaneously, as a physical place, partly on land and partly underwater, with structures and artifacts that can in principle be dated and analysed, and as a cultural presence, alive in literature and identity and ritual, carrying meanings that have accumulated over centuries and that no single excavation report will fully resolve. Both registers are real, both matter, and neither one is well served by the other being ignored. The archaeologists who dismiss the cultural tradition as irrelevant mythology miss something important about why this site deserves serious attention. The cultural advocates who treat the literary tradition as proof of specific historical claims miss something important about the difference between memory and evidence. The most honest position is probably the most uncomfortable one, that the cultural memory of Poompuhar is meaningful and worth taking seriously, that it points towards something real, and that what exactly that something is remains genuinely uncertain. What we can say is that the memory has survived. The poems are still read, the town still bears the name, the sea is still there, as it has always been, holding whatever it holds, indifferent to the arguments being conducted above it about what it might contain. And the question of what the archaeology actually shows, what the physical evidence can and cannot tell us, what has been properly investigated and what has not, is a question that the cultural memory alone cannot answer. That requires a different kind of attention, a careful look at what the surveys have found, what they have missed, and what it would take to find out more. So the question becomes a practical one. If the site is real, if something is down there, if the structures at depth are genuinely worth understanding, then why has no one gone back to investigate them properly? Why, decades after the initial surveys, does the deeper anomaly remain essentially what it was when divers first reported it? A shape on the sea floor described in general terms, photographed imperfectly, debated extensively and left largely alone. The answer is not simple, and it is not the result of any single decision or failure. It is the product of several overlapping constraints, institutional, logistical, financial and political, that have accumulated over time and reinforced each other in ways that have made serious investigation of Poompuhar's underwater structures genuinely difficult to carry out. Start with the institutional side. The Archaeological Survey of India, the ASI, is the primary body responsible for the country's archaeological heritage, and for most of its history, it has been almost entirely focused on terrestrial sites. Underwater archaeology in India developed late and slowly. The ASY's underwater archaeology wing was formally established only in the 1980s, and for many years it operated with limited personnel, limited equipment, and limited institutional support. The NIO, the National Institute of Oceanography, contributed significantly to the early surveys of Poompuhar and other submerged sites. But the NIO is a scientific research institution, not an archaeological excavation body. Its mandate and its methods are oriented toward oceanographic research, rather than the kind of careful, artifact-by-artifact excavation that a submerged archaeological site requires. The gap between what the NIO could provide and what a proper archaeological investigation would demand was significant, and for a long time there was no institutional body in India well positioned to bridge it. Funding is its own issue. Deep underwater archaeology is expensive in a way that land-based excavation simply is not. A controlled excavation of a site at 23 metres depth, in open water, several kilometres offshore, in the Bay of Bengal, requires specialised vessels, diving equipment, and personnel with training that goes well beyond standard archaeological fieldwork. It requires remotely operated vehicles capable of working at depth, sub-bottom profilers to map what lies beneath the sediment surface, and the kind of sustained operational capacity that cannot be assembled for a 2-week survey and then put away. The cost of a serious multi-season investigation of the Poompuhar deep site would run into figures that are difficult to justify through normal archaeological funding channels, particularly when the site's significance remains officially uncertain and when there are thousands of documented terrestrial sites across India competing for the same limited resources. There is also the question of what exactly would be found. Underwater excavation is difficult to justify to funding bodies when the fundamental question of whether the site is man-made has not been definitively answered. The deep structure at Poompuhar has not been confirmed as artificial. It has been described as possibly artificial, probably artificial by some researchers, and as a natural rock formation by others who are more cautious. Without that basic confirmation, the case for committing the resources required for a full excavation is hard to make in purely scientific terms, and yet the confirmation itself requires the kind of close investigation that only a proper survey can provide. It is a circular problem. The evidence needed to justify the excavation is the same evidence the excavation would produce. Then there are the political dimensions, and these are worth being careful about, because they run in more than one direction. Poompuhar sits at the intersection of archaeology and Tamil cultural identity in ways that create pressure from multiple sides simultaneously. On one side, there is pressure to confirm the site's antiquity, to demonstrate that Tamil civilization extends back further than conventional archaeology acknowledges, to use the underwater structures as evidence for the kind of deep historical presence that cultural and political movements have argued for. This pressure does not always come from bad faith. For many Tamil scholars and cultural figures, the question of Poompuhar's age is genuinely important, connected to a larger argument about how South Asian history has been written and whose contributions have been acknowledged. But the pressure to confirm a particular conclusion can distort the process of investigation. It can lead researchers to interpret ambiguous evidence more confidently than the evidence warrants, to present possibilities as probabilities, and to treat a lack of disproof as equivalent to proof. On the other side, there is academic and institutional caution that can tip into avoidance. Scholars who are wary of being associated with nationalist narratives, or with the kind of popular speculation that Graham Hancock's work represents, may be reluctant to engage seriously with Poompuhar at all. The site has been claimed by people making arguments that mainstream archaeology finds unconvincing, and that association can make careful researchers hesitant to invest their reputations in it. The result is a kind of institutional distance from the site, a reluctance to commit to serious investigation partly because of what the investigation might be seen to endorse, regardless of what it actually finds. Neither of these pressures serves the archaeology. Both of them have contributed to the gap between what is known and what could be known. The legal framework around underwater cultural heritage in India adds another layer of complexity. The Antiquities and Art Treasures Act of 1972 provides some protection for cultural property, but its application to submerged sites is less clear than its application to terrestrial ones. India signed the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage in 2001, but the domestic legal and regulatory infrastructure for managing submerged archaeological sites has developed unevenly. Questions about jurisdiction, about who has the authority to permit excavation, about how finds would be managed and conserved, about the legal status of a site that lies several kilometres offshore in open water, are not trivial ones. They require coordination between multiple government ministries and agencies, and that coordination has historically been slow and incomplete. Compare this with how other countries have approached similar situations. Greece has an extensive underwater archaeology program developed over decades, with dedicated research vessels, trained personnel, and a legal framework specifically designed for submerged heritage sites. The Greek effort of underwater antiquities has conducted systematic surveys of hundreds of submerged sites in the Aegean and Mediterranean, producing detailed documentation and, in some cases, full excavations. Turkey has invested substantially in underwater archaeology, particularly along its Aegean coast, where submerged Bronze Age and classical sites have been surveyed and studied with considerable methodological rigour. Croatia has developed one of the more sophisticated underwater archaeology programs in the Mediterranean, combining academic research with heritage management in ways that have produced significant results. Israel has conducted systematic surveys of its submerged prehistoric coastlines, documenting sites at Atlit Yam and elsewhere that provide genuine evidence of early human settlement beneath the sea. These programs share certain features: sustained institutional commitment, dedicated funding, trained specialists, and a legal framework that facilitates rather than impedes investigation. India has made some progress in this direction, but the progress has been uneven, and the capacity remains limited relative to the scale of the country's submerged coastal heritage. The Poompuhar site has not benefited from the kind of sustained, well-resourced investigation that comparable sites in the Mediterranean have received, and the gap in outcomes reflects that difference in investment. The physical conditions at the site are genuinely challenging, and it would be unfair not to acknowledge that. The Bay of Bengal is not an easy place to work. Visibility in the water near the Tamil Nadu coast can be very poor, particularly during and after the monsoon season, when runoff from the land carries sediment into the coastal waters and reduces underwater visibility to a metre or two, sometimes less. Even in the clearer months, visibility at depth near Poompuhar is often described as limited, making visual inspection and photography difficult. The monsoon season itself, which runs roughly from June through September, makes offshore work essentially impossible for months at a time, compressing the operational window for any survey into a relatively short period each year. Currents in the area can be strong and unpredictable. Sedimentation rates are significant, meaning that structures on the seafloor accumulate new layers of sediment relatively quickly, obscuring features and making it harder to distinguish between natural and artificial formations. The combination of poor visibility, strong currents, and active sedimentation creates conditions that are genuinely demanding, even for experienced underwater archaeologists working with good equipment. A diver at 23 metres in the Bay of Bengal near Poompuhar is not working in the clear, calm conditions of a Mediterranean dive site. The environment pushes back in practical, physical ways that compound all the institutional and financial obstacles. What would a proper survey actually require? Researchers who have thought carefully about this have described a combination of approaches. Sub-bottom profiling, which uses acoustic signals to map structures beneath the sediment surface, would allow researchers to understand the extent and layout of subsurface features without relying on visual inspection alone. This technology has been used successfully at submerged sites elsewhere and could provide a much clearer picture of what lies beneath the seafloor at Poompuhar than current surveys have been able to produce. Remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, equipped with cameras, lighting systems and manipulator arms, could conduct detailed visual surveys and collect samples from the deep site without requiring divers to work at depth in difficult conditions. ROV technology has advanced considerably in recent years, and the kind of vehicle that would be needed for a site at 23 metres is well within the range of currently available systems. Controlled sampling of sediment and organic material from the site would allow radiocarbon dating and other analytical techniques to establish a chronology for the site's formation, and, if the structures are artificial, for their construction. The current status of the site, as of the early 2020s, is one of partial attention and unresolved potential. There have been periodic surveys, renewed interest following Hancock's popularisation of the site, and ongoing discussion in both academic and popular contexts. The ASI has acknowledged the site's significance and the need for further investigation. The NIOs continue to maintain an interest in the area, but a sustained, well-funded, methodologically rigorous investigation of the deep structure at Poompuhar has not been completed. The site remains in a kind of holding pattern, documented enough to be taken seriously, not investigated enough to be understood. There is something a little frustrating about this if you think about it honestly. The site has been known about for more than 40 years. The technology required to investigate it properly has existed in one form or another for most of that time. The scientific questions it raises are genuinely significant. And yet the investigation has remained incomplete, held back by a combination of institutional inertia, funding constraints, political complications, and environmental challenges that, taken individually, might each be manageable, but that together have been sufficient to prevent the kind of serious engagement the site deserves. It is worth being clear that this is not a conspiracy of suppression. Nobody is actively preventing the investigation of Poompuhar. There is no government directive to leave the site alone, no academic conspiracy to protect a preferred version of history. The obstacles are more mundane than that, and in some ways more stubborn precisely because they are mundane. Bureaucratic inertia does not have a clear point of intervention. Funding competition does not have an obvious villain. The political sensitivity of the site does not produce a single decision that could be reversed. These are systemic problems, and systemic problems tend to persist longer than deliberate ones, because there is no single actor who can simply decide to fix them. What would change this? Realistically, a combination of things. Dedicated funding specifically allocated for underwater archaeology at high-priority sites, an institutional framework that gives a single body clear authority and responsibility for the investigation, a political environment in which the results of the investigation can be accepted whatever they turn out to be, and a sustained operational commitment that extends across multiple field seasons rather than being limited to brief surveys. None of these are impossible. Some countries have managed all of them, but they require a level of coordinated institutional will that has not yet been applied to Poompuhar, and so the site waits. The structures at depth continue to accumulate sediment. The shallow finds continue to erode in the coastal waters. The literary tradition continues to describe a city of extraordinary beauty that the sea swallowed whole. The fishermen continue to perform their ceremonies at the water's edge. The researchers continue to write papers that conclude with calls for further investigation. And the Bay of Bengal continues to hold whatever it holds, patient and opaque, indifferent to the arguments being conducted in the libraries and conference rooms above it. What has been found is real. What it means is not yet clear, and the distance between those two facts is not primarily a scientific distance. It is an institutional one. That is not a satisfying conclusion, but it is an honest one. The gap in our knowledge about Poompuhar is not primarily the result of the evidence being too ambiguous, or the questions being too difficult. It is the result of the investigation not having been completed. And that, in a way, is both the most frustrating thing about this story and the most hopeful. Because unlike the mysteries that are genuinely beyond our reach, the mystery of Poompuhar is, in principle, solvable. The tools exist. The questions are clear. The site is there, under a known depth of water, at a known location, a few kilometres off the coast of Tamil Nadu. What remains is the will to look properly, and what that investigation might actually find, and what it would mean for everything we think we know about the deep past of human civilization on this coast, is a question that deserves to be answered. So let us be honest about what we actually know. Not what has been claimed, not what has been hoped, not what the most dramatic interpretation of the evidence would suggest, but what has been documented, confirmed and established with reasonable confidence. Because Poompuhar deserves that kind of honesty. It is a site that has attracted enough speculation and enough enthusiasm and enough politically motivated interpretation that the actual evidence can get a little lost in the noise. And the actual evidence, when you look at it carefully, is genuinely interesting enough that it does not need embellishment. The shallow water finds are real. The structures at 1 to 6 meters depth, the brick walls, the terracotta figurines, the copper coins, the horseshoe-shaped feature roughly 20 meters across. These have been documented by professional researchers from the National Institute of Oceanography and the Archaeological Survey of India. They're consistent in their construction and material with what we know of Chola period architecture from the onshore record. They fit reasonably well the picture of a prosperous coastal city that existed in the early centuries of the Common Era and that was gradually inundated as the coastline shifted. The Manimekalai and the Silapatikaram describe a real place. The archaeology, at least in the shallows, confirms that a real place existed. These two things align, and that alignment is significant. It tells us that the literary tradition of Poompuhar is not purely mythological. It is anchored in something that was actually there. That is already more than many ancient cities can claim. There are places described in old texts that archaeology has never been able to locate at all. Poompuhar is not one of them. The city was real. The inundation was real. The memory preserved in 2,000 years of Tamil literature is a memory of something that happened. That is worth saying clearly, because it sometimes gets overshadowed by the more dramatic arguments about deep prehistory. And then there is the deeper structure. The anomaly at approximately 23 meters depth, roughly 5 kilometers offshore. Something is there. The sonar surveys and the diver reports agree on that much. The structure, as described, is large, roughly U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped, approximately 40 meters across. It is at a depth that, based on what we know about post-glacial sea level rise along this coast, would have been above water somewhere between roughly 7,000 and 11,000 years ago, depending on how you account for local tectonic subsidence and sedimentation. Those are wide margins, and they are wide for a reason. The local geological picture is complex, and the data needed to narrow those margins has not been collected with the precision the question requires. What is not established is whether the deep structure is man-made. This is the central unresolved question, and it is genuinely unresolved. It has not been confirmed as artificial. It has also not been confirmed as natural. The surveys conducted so far have not produced the kind of controlled, detailed, stratigraphically documented evidence that would allow researchers to make that determination with confidence. The structure has been observed, it has been described, it has not been excavated or systematically sampled in a way that would settle the question of its origin. That is the honest position, and it is important to hold on to it, because the gap between something is there and something man-made is there is very large, and the gap between something man-made is there and this is an 11,000-year-old city is larger still. What would it mean, though, if the deep structure turned out to be genuinely artificial? It is worth sitting with that question for a moment, not as a certainty, but as a possibility worth understanding. If the structure at 23 meters depth is confirmed as man-made, and if the geological evidence places its submergence at roughly 9 to 11,000 years ago, it would represent one of the oldest known structured human settlements on Earth. To put that in context, Çatalhöyük, the famous Neolithic site in what is now Turkey, dates to approximately 7,500 BCE, which is around 9,500 years ago. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, which has reshaped how archaeologists think about early monumental construction, dates its main architectural phases to roughly 9,000 to 10,000 BCE. A confirmed structure at Poompuhar dating to the same general period would place organised human construction in South Asia at the same horizon as the most significant early sites we know anywhere in the world. That would be extraordinary. Not because it would necessarily mean a lost civilization of the kind popular writers sometimes describe, with advanced technology and global influence and all the rest of it. It would not require any of that. What it would mean, more simply and more significantly, is that the timeline of organised human settlement in South Asia extends much further back than the current archaeological record demonstrates. It would suggest that the Kaveri River Delta, and by extension the broader coastal regions of southern India, supported structured human communities during or shortly after the last ice age, at a time when the coastline was dramatically different from what it is today, and when large areas of what is now the Bay of Bengal were dry land. This would not be surprising from a purely anthropological standpoint. We know that modern humans have inhabited South Asia for tens of thousands of years. We know that coastal environments are among the most productive and attractive for human settlement, offering access to marine food sources, fresh water from river mouths, and relatively mild climates. We know that a significant portion of the world's prehistoric coastal settlements are now underwater, because sea levels rose substantially after the last glacial maximum and drowned the coastlines that early humans actually lived on. The idea that people lived and built things on the coast of what is now Tamil Nadu 9 or 10,000 years ago is not inherently implausible. It is in fact exactly what you would expect if you think carefully about where people tend to settle and what happened to those settlements when the sea rose. What would be significant about a confirmed Poompuhar structure is not that people lived there. It is the scale and organisation implied by a 40-metre structure. A feature of that size, if it is artificial, suggests not a temporary camp or a small family group, but some degree of organised community effort. It suggests a settlement with enough population and social organisation to undertake a construction project of meaningful scale. That is the part that would require us to revise our picture of early human society in this part of the world. It would also complicate, in productive ways, the relationship between the archaeological record and the literary record in South Asia. The Tamil Sangam tradition has always claimed a depth of history that the physical evidence has struggled to fully support. Scholars have sometimes been sceptical of the more ambitious claims about Tamil antiquity, not because the tradition is not old, but because the material evidence has not kept pace with the textual claims. A confirmed ancient structure at Poompuhar would not validate every claim ever made about Kumarikandam or Tamil civilization's mythological deep past. But it would demonstrate that the tradition's sense of very deep roots in this coastline has at least some physical basis, that the poets who wrote about the sea swallowing the city were not simply inventing a metaphor. They were perhaps reaching back toward a memory that was itself reaching back toward something real. There is a difference, though, between a mystery and a conspiracy, and it is worth being clear about which of these Poompuhar is. A conspiracy requires suppression, deliberate concealment, actors with an interest in keeping the truth hidden. Poompuhar is not that. The researchers who have worked at the site have published their findings. The ASI and NIO reports are in the academic record. The debates about the site's significance have been conducted openly in journals, in books, at conferences. Nobody has tried to hide the deep structure. The difficulty is not concealment, it is investigation. The site has not been suppressed. It has been underfunded, logistically challenged, and caught in a tangle of institutional and political complications that have prevented the serious excavation it needs. That is a very different situation, and it matters to understand the distinction. The honest scientific position on Poompuhar is this: the site is intriguing. The shallow finds are credible and well documented. The deep structure is real in the sense that something is there, and its depth is consistent with the possibility of significant age. But the deep structure has not been confirmed as artificial, has not been dated, and has not been excavated in a way that would allow definitive conclusions. The site warrants serious, sustained, properly funded investigation. That investigation has not happened. Until it does, the most intellectually responsible position is one of genuine open interest, not confident assertion in either direction. This is, admittedly, a less satisfying position than the alternatives. It is more satisfying to say the city is definitely there, and it is definitely 11,000 years old, and it proves everything the tradition has always claimed. It is also, in its own way, more satisfying to say the whole thing is wishful thinking, and the deep structure is just a rock formation, and there is nothing here worth taking seriously. Both of those positions have the virtue of being definitive. Neither of them is warranted by the evidence. What the evidence warrants is something more patient. It warrants saying, there is something here, we do not fully understand it yet. The questions it raises are real and significant. The tools to answer those questions exist. The investigation should be done carefully and without a predetermined conclusion. And whatever the investigation finds, it should be accepted honestly, whether it confirms the more dramatic possibilities or deflates them. There is something almost quietly moving about a site that has been waiting like this. The deep structure, whatever it is, has been sitting under 23 meters of water for thousands of years. The Bay of Bengal has been above it for longer than any human civilization has been keeping written records. The fishermen of the Tamil Nadu coast have been performing their ceremonies at the water's edge, offering prayers to a sea they have always known takes things and does not always give them back. The poets have been writing about a city of extraordinary beauty for 2,000 years, and before them, presumably, other poets were doing the same in forms we no longer have. And through all of that, the structure, if it is a structure, has simply been there, under the sediment, under the water, indifferent to the arguments. There is something in that image that makes the question feel less urgent and more important at the same time. Less urgent because the site is not going anywhere. More important because the question it raises about the depth of human history on this coast is not a trivial one. It touches on something fundamental about how we understand the relationship between human beings and the coastlines they have always been drawn to. The coastlines that the sea has always eventually claimed. The story of Poompuhar is not, at its core, a story about a lost civilization in the sensational sense. It is a story about what happens to the places people build and love and live in when the world changes around them. The sea rose. It rose everywhere after the glaciers melted, and it rose slowly enough that the people living on those coasts would not have experienced it as a sudden catastrophe, but quickly enough over generations to transform the landscape beyond recognition. The city that the Manimekalai describes being swallowed by the sea may have been swallowed gradually over centuries, with people watching the waterline move closer and eventually abandoning the lower streets, then the harbour, then the outer districts, until what remained of the city was the elevated parts, and then eventually nothing at all above the surface. Or the shallower inundation may have been faster, driven by storm surge or coastal subsidence, rather than gradual sea level rise. The text describes something more sudden, a divine punishment, a great wave, a night when the sea came in and did not retreat. Whether that narrative is literal, metaphorical, or some combination of both is something we cannot know from the texts alone. It is one of the things a proper investigation of the site might help clarify. What we can say is that the memory of the loss has been preserved with remarkable fidelity. 2,000 years of literary tradition, maintaining the name of the city, the description of its harbour and its streets, the grief of its loss, the knowledge that it lies somewhere beneath the water. That kind of cultural memory does not survive by accident. It survives because people found it worth preserving, because the loss felt real and significant enough to pass on, because the city mattered, and that, in its own way, is a kind of evidence. Not archaeological evidence, not the kind that can be dated or measured or submitted to a peer-reviewed journal, but evidence of something. Evidence that this place existed in the imagination and the grief of a civilization for long enough to leave traces that are still legible today. Evidence that the sea took something that people valued and that they never entirely stopped looking back at the water and remembering it. The story of Poompuhar is not over. It is not resolved. It is waiting in the most literal sense for someone to look at it properly. The deep structure sits at its known coordinates, under its known depth of water, holding whatever it holds. The question of its age and origin is a real scientific question with a real answer, an answer that exists even if we do not yet know it, and the possibility that the answer, when it finally comes, might rewrite something fundamental about the deep history of human civilization on this coast. That possibility is not negligible. It is in fact exactly the kind of possibility that makes the patience required to pursue it worthwhile. So let us go back to the water for a moment. Imagine the Bay of Bengal at night. Not from a ship, not from a research vessel with sonar equipment humming below decks, but from the shore. From the modern town of Poompuhar, which sits quietly on the Tamil Nadu coast, a small and unassuming place that carries one of the oldest names in South Asian literature. The streets are not grand, the buildings are modest. There is a museum there, and a shore temple, and the wide mouth of the Kaveri River reaching the sea at the same delta. It has been reaching for longer than anyone can precisely say. At night the water is dark and the horizon is invisible, and the sound of the waves is the same sound that the merchants and poets and sailors of the ancient city would have heard when they stood at this same edge of land and looked out at the same darkness. The Kaveri still comes. That is one of the things that stays with you when you think about this story for long enough. The river has not changed course. The delta is still here. The land that remains above the water is still here, still inhabited, still remembered. And somewhere out beyond the shoreline, under 23 metres of water, something is sitting on the seafloor that has not been properly examined, that has not been dated, that has not been given a definitive answer one way or the other. It is just there, as it has been for a very long time. There is something about that image that does not feel dramatic exactly. It feels quiet. It feels like the kind of patience that does not announce itself. The modern town of Poompuhar has a population of a few thousand people. It is not a major city. It does not have the scale or the noise of Chennai, which lies roughly 280 kilometres to the north. It has fishing boats and a beach and the kind of ordinary daily life that most small coastal towns have. But it also has this other thing, this weight of a name, this connection to something that the surrounding culture has never entirely let go of. The museum there holds artefacts recovered from the shallow underwater surveys, terracotta figurines, fragments of pottery, objects that speak to the historically documented city of the Chola period. There are also reproductions and displays about the Sangam literature, about the Manimekalai, about the descriptions of the ancient harbour. The town knows what it is sitting next to. It knows what the sea is holding. Every year, fishermen and local communities perform rituals at the water's edge that carry the memory of what was lost. These are not tourist performances. They are old practices, the kind that get passed down because they feel necessary, because the sea is not just a body of water to the people who live beside it, but a presence, a relationship, something that gives and takes in ways that require acknowledgement. The Tamil word for the sea-taking land, kadal, is not a metaphor in this tradition. It is a description of something that actually happened, something that living memory and cultural memory have kept hold of even when the physical evidence was buried under silt and salt water. And that continuity is remarkable when you sit with it. 2,000 years is a very long time for a literary tradition to maintain the name and the grief of a specific lost place. The Manimekalai was composed roughly in the 2nd to 5th century of the Common Era, and it describes the sea swallowing Poompuhar as something that had already happened, something the poet was looking back on, which means the memory of the loss was already old when the poem was written. The city that the poem mourns was not a recent casualty. It was something from an earlier time, already receding into the deeper past, already becoming the kind of story that gets told to explain why a place is gone, and yet the telling was precise enough and careful enough and felt important enough that it survived. It survived the centuries between the Sangam period and the medieval period. It survived the medieval period and the colonial period. It survived into the modern era, where it sits at the intersection of archaeology and literature and geology and cultural identity, waiting for the kind of careful attention that would let us understand it more fully. What does it mean for a city to be remembered in poetry for 2,000 years? It means, at minimum, that the city mattered, that the people who knew it, or who knew people who knew it, or who inherited the grief of its loss through the chain of generations, found it worth keeping. Cities do not get mourned in verse for 2 millennia unless something about them lodged deeply in the imagination of the people who built them. The Silapatikaram describes Poompuhar streets and its festivals, and the sound of the sea against its harbour walls, with a kind of specificity that comes from either direct knowledge or very close inheritance of direct knowledge. The warehouses full of goods from distant places, the multilingual noise of a busy port, the lighthouse, the smell of the sea mixed with the smell of spices and pearls and fine cloth. These are not generic descriptions of a generic city. They are the details of a specific place that someone found beautiful and worth preserving. And then the sea came, and the city went under, and the poets wrote about it, and the people remembered. There is a kind of grief in the Tamil literary tradition around the loss of land to the sea that runs deeper than any single poem or any single city. The concept of Kumari Kandam, the idea of a great southern landmass that was swallowed by the ocean in a distant past, is part of this same emotional geography. Whether or not Kumari Kandam corresponds to any real geological event in the way some have claimed, the feeling behind it is real. The feeling that the sea has taken things, that the land people once lived on and loved is now somewhere beneath the water, that the coastline is not permanent, that the boundary between the human world and the ocean is not fixed, that what exists today may not exist tomorrow, and what the sea holds today it may have taken from someone. That feeling is not mythology in the dismissive sense. It is a response to something true about the world. Coastlines do change. The sea does take land. People have been watching it happen and mourning it for as long as there have been people living on coasts. Poompuhar is one specific instance of something that has happened in hundreds of places around the world. The North Sea once had land across it, a vast low plain called Doggerland that connected Britain to continental Europe and was home to communities of hunter-gatherers who lived and died there before the sea rose and covered everything. The Mediterranean has submerged settlements along its coasts, Greek and Roman harbours now lying under several metres of water, the structures still visible to divers. The coast of Israel has submerged Neolithic villages. The coast of Croatia has submerged Bronze Age sites. The Gulf of Kambat off the coast of Gujarat has its own contested anomalies. Dwarka, also off the Gujarat coast, has documented submerged structures that the National Institute of Oceanography has surveyed and published findings on. The world's coastlines are full of places where human history is sitting underwater, waiting to be found or waiting to be properly understood. Poompuhar is part of that global story. It is not unique in the sense of being the only place where this has happened. It is particular in the sense that it has a specific name, a specific literary tradition, a specific set of physical findings, and a specific open question about a deep structure that may or may not predate everything else we know about the site. That combination of things is what makes it worth paying attention to, not because it proves some grand alternative history, not because it confirms any particular theory about the deep past, but because it is a real place with a real history and a real unresolved question, and those things deserve real investigation. The patience required to understand the deep past is a specific kind of patience. It is not the patience of waiting for something to happen. It is the patience of working carefully toward an answer that may take decades to arrive, that may require technology that does not yet fully exist, that may require political conditions that are not yet present, that may require the right combination of funding and institutional will and scientific curiosity all converging at the same moment. It is the patience of knowing that the answer is there, that it exists, that the seafloor holds it, and that the work of getting to it is slow and difficult and worth doing anyway. The researchers who have worked on this site over the decades, the teams from the National Institute of Oceanography, the Archaeological Survey of India, the divers who went down in poor visibility and came back with descriptions of structures they could barely see, the scientists who published careful reports and made cautious claims and tried to separate what was known from what was speculated, all of them have been doing that kind of patient work. It has not produced a final answer, but it has produced a foundation. It has established that something is there. It has established that the shallow finds are real and consistent with the historically documented city. It has established that the deep structure exists and has not been explained away. That foundation is not nothing. It is the beginning of an answer. And perhaps that is the most honest thing to say about Poompuhar at this moment in history. It is a beginning, not a conclusion, not a solved mystery, not a confirmed discovery of the oldest city on Earth, not a debunked fantasy, a beginning, a site with real evidence, real questions and real potential, waiting for the conditions that would allow those questions to be answered properly. The Bay of Bengal does not give up its secrets easily. The water is murky, the currents are strong, the monsoon disrupts everything for months at a time. The visibility at depth can be measured in centimetres rather than metres. These are not metaphors, they are the actual physical conditions that make this work hard. But they are not insurmountable. They are engineering problems, logistical problems, problems that human ingenuity has solved in harder environments. The tools exist. The knowledge exists. What has been missing for the most part is the sustained commitment to use them here. Maybe that will change. There are reasons to think it might. Underwater archaeology as a discipline has grown considerably over the past few decades. The technology available to survey and excavate submerged sites has improved dramatically. The legal and institutional frameworks for protecting underwater cultural heritage have strengthened. The scientific community's interest in submerged landscapes from the post-glacial period has increased, partly because of what those landscapes might tell us about human migration and coastal settlement patterns during the critical period when the ice was melting and the sea was rising. Poompuhar sits right at the intersection of all of those interests. It is, in that sense, well positioned for the kind of attention it has not yet fully received. And somewhere in the town of Poompuhar tonight, the sea is doing what it has always done. It is moving. It is making its sound against the shore. The Kaveri is reaching it from the west, carrying the sediment of the interior down to the delta. The fishing boats are resting. The temple is quiet. The museum is closed. The water is dark and the horizon is invisible, and under 23 metres of it, at coordinates that are known and recorded, the deep structure is sitting exactly where it has been sitting for however many thousands of years it has been sitting there. Indifferent, patient, waiting. There is something almost comforting in that, strangely enough. Not because the mystery is resolved, but because it is not going anywhere. The question is still open, and it will remain open until someone answers it, and the fact that it is still open means the answer is still possible. The city, or what remains of it, has survived everything that the sea and the time and the sediment could do to it. It has survived long enough for the people above it to develop the tools to find it and the language to ask about it. That is its own kind of patience. That is its own kind of endurance. The ancient poets who wrote about Poompuhar were not wrong to find it worth mourning. A city of that richness and that beauty, a port where the world came to trade, where the sound of multiple languages mixed with the sound of the sea, where the lighthouse stood at the harbour mouth and the warehouses were full and the streets were busy with the ordinary, extraordinary noise of human life. That city deserved to be remembered, and it has been. For 2,000 years and more it has been remembered. That is not a small thing. Small, whatever the deep structure turns out to be, whatever the investigation eventually finds, the story of Poompuhar will remain worth knowing. because it is a story about what the sea takes, and what human memory refuses to let go of, and what the patience of careful inquiry can eventually recover. It is a story about the relationship between a civilization and the coast it built itself on, and the way that relationship can be interrupted without being ended. The coast is still there, the name is still there, the river is still there. The grief, transformed over centuries into literature and ritual and quiet ceremony at the water's edge, is still there. And the question is still there, 23 meters down, waiting for an answer. Wherever you are tonight, whatever hour it is, whatever the air feels like where you're sitting or lying or drifting towards sleep, I hope this story has given you something to carry gently into the quiet. Not urgency, not anxiety. Just the soft, steady feeling of a question that matters, sitting patiently under dark water, holding its own kind of light. Thank you for spending this time here. If Poompuhar stayed with you, if the image of that submerged coast and that ancient literary grief and that unresolved deep structure left something behind in your thoughts, I would be grateful if you gave this video a like and subscribe to Life Beyond Seen. It helps this channel find other people who like their questions slow and their stories long and their nights a little more interesting than they were before. There are more stories waiting, more places the world has half forgotten, more questions sitting underwater or under sand or under centuries of silence, and we will get to them one by one at whatever pace the night allows. For now, let the Bay of Bengal do what it has always done. Let the water move, let the cavalry reach the sea, let the deep structure sit at its known coordinates, quiet and unhurried, keeping its answer for a little while longer. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are, the sea is patient, so are we.